gentle and of course very modern apes. It's good to see you again. I'm just coming off of a month of fieldwork in West Kenya looking at the early Miocene, and yet here we are with the first thing we're talking about with me being back in my home at my setup is Homanaletti again. What's up with that? What's the deal? What's the story? Why Homanaletti? Again, we just covered it a few videos ago. We could start my return off with a conversation about my amazing time doing really cool fieldwork with incredible people, but instead we're talking about this hominin again. Why? Well, you guys, let me catch you up as briefly as possible. So a few months ago, Lee Berger, the paleoanthropologist who is publishing on Homanaletti and whose team is responsible for the excavation of the Dinaledi chamber, where all of the specimens are coming from, had a talk, a Carnegie presentation, where he revealed that he has support for intentional burial and art for this hominin, and we'll discuss why that's weird in a second. So let me catch you up a little bit on Homanaletti if you know nothing about it or the sort of drama at hand. Homanaletti is a hominin. It is in our genus Homo, and it was first discovered in 2015 by Lee Berger and colleagues in the Dinaledi cave system in South Africa. Right off the bat, we knew this thing was weird. It looks human in many ways, or at least derived in many ways, while other aspects of it are super basal or primitive. So for instance, it's got a teeny tiny brain case size ranging from 400 to 600 cc's. That's Australopith-like on the low end and half that of a modern human on the upper end. However, the dentition is remarkably modern, and it's got a flat face, more similar to modern humans than many other hominins in the fossil record. It was clearly bipedal on the basis of the foramen magnum and the rest of the morphology. It has long legs with an inline big toe, 3 arches in the foot, and a valgus knee. However, it's got really long arms and a very primitive shoulder blade that would have allowed it to be pretty dang good in the trees. But its hands have a very dexterous look to them. The grip is remarkably familiar, although this is combined with curved phalanges, which again indicates still spending some time in the trees. Basically, you've got a combination of modern and very basal characteristics in a hominin that, and this was the big mind blower, lived only 250,000 to 350,000 years ago. To make matters stranger, in this cave system, Homanaletti is basically the only animal found in there, other than like a baboon tooth, some bird bones, which is going to be relevant later, and some rodents, which is pretty typical for living in caves anyways. So this is really uncommon for a cave system, though. Like, it pretty much rules out the notion that this is a carnivore den and all these Homanaletti individuals who at present number over 24. This is one of the greatest fossiliferous sites for hominins that we know of. Not the greatest, but one of them. They're the only things in there, which is what initially led Lee Berger and colleagues to propose that maybe they were put there not by some kind of natural event or carnivores or predators, but by members of their own species as a form of funeral caching, or maybe even intentional funerary practices. So this went over very poorly at the time within the paleoanthropological community for a few reasons. One, it's really difficult to get to where the individuals of Homanaletti are found for modern humans with modern tools, leaving the question open as to how Homanaletti even got back there in the first place, if it indeed was navigating these dark chasms. Did it have fire? The evidence at present certainly didn't suggest so. And then there's the additional problem of it's got a teeny tiny pea brain, and we don't know of any hominins with brains of that size that were doing what was proposed by Lee and colleagues. And yet here we are nearly a decade later with Lee giving a presentation on burial and art in Homanaletti with its tiny pea brain in the Dinaledi cave systems. So you can imagine that this ruffled a lot of feathers. For one, because typically this isn't how big news is announced. Typically you hear about pretty groundbreaking stuff like this after it's been through peer review by folks who are within relevant fields and specialties. This also isn't the first time that Lee has done this. In fact, a few months earlier, back in December of 2022, he gave a similar Carnegie presentation on proposed fire use in Homanaletti in the cave systems that they are found within. Only unlike the preprints and the burial and art situation, we still don't have any kind of literature to back up those claims. So the timeline so far is presentation about Homanaletti using fire, presentation about Homanaletti burying its dead and utilizing art. And then what comes next is a series of preprints, so 3 articles released to the public before they've been peer-reviewed as a sort of widespread open access concerning the burial and concerning the art. The response to these preprints was downright explosive, and not just on paleo Twitter. And the reason for this is because not only was the news very big and everybody extremely eager to see exactly how Lee and his team backed up the claims that had been presented in the talk earlier, but also because Lee had talked to oodles and oodles of news outlets like CNN and Nat Geo, etc., etc. And so those reports also dropped just in time with the preprints. It was a media blitz. And people in the paleoanthropological community weren't super happy for a few reasons. One, they got to read the preprints and everybody had an opinion on that, myself included, but also because of the timing. The preprints came out within a month or so, as well as the media blitz, within a month or so of the release of Lee Berger's book, Cave of Bones, and the Netflix documentary. So immediately, and a lot of folks weren't shy on voicing their opinions on this, people began to make it known that there was a weird timing thing going on with the release of the preprints first, followed by the book and the documentary, potentially suggesting that there was a rush to get the preprints out to validate whatever was being said in those latter 2 pieces of media. So that was where we left off. That's what I covered in my previous video about a month ago. We read through the preprints very preliminarily. In fact, we basically just went over the abstracts, and I gave you my opinion on them, which was very simply big if true. If what Lee is saying and his team, if what they're saying is correct in these preprints, wow, that's pretty mind-boggling. And again, we'll talk about why in just a second, although I really would just recommend going back and watching that video. And we also talked about the early pushback to these preprints, the thoughts of paleoanthropologists like Chris Stringer, folks who study burials and their positions, as well as folks who study art and what they thought of these engravings and of the claims made by Lee and his team. And we noted that they were all pretty tentative and all, again, in the shadow of the timing of the release of these preprints alongside the Netflix documentary and the book. And not only that, but we put a big old underscore on the concept that these are in fact preprints, that a lot of this, big if true, a lot of the facts as stated by Lee and his colleagues are dependent on the peer review process and whether or not the claims as presented in the papers held up to the scrutiny of people who study exactly those topics. Because in academia, generally, there are going to be areas that you know a lot better than others. You know, your specialty within your field. So I know a lot about paleoanthropology and primatology, but specifically, I know a hell of a lot more about canine sexual dimorphism than I do about burial practices. For this reason, I rely on the experts within paleoanthropology who do study burial practices to vet the information that comes out of new discoveries. This is like the entire point of peer review in general. So this is why I was a bit tentative in my previous video. I noted that, at least in the case of the burial paper, sure, it sounds really compelling. Lee is saying that these proposed burials of Homanaletti do meet the minimum standard by which we assess early archaic Homo sapiens burials. And if that's true, and he cited his sources and everything, and if that's true, wow, that's awesome, that's really great. But the question is, do they? And that's what I rely on the burial experts for, who can actually look at the material as presented by Lee, also in the supplementary material, and basically assess for me, as experts of burials, is what Lee is presenting true? Does it hold up to scrutiny? And that's what we're here talking about today, because the peer reviews were published alongside the articles themselves, now published as actual manuscripts in eLife, because this is something that eLife is trying out, a new mode of publishing where they accept the papers as submitted and don't necessarily require changes, but publish them alongside the peer reviews themselves. Now, there is a lot to say about this particular model of publishing, and we will get there. But first, I have to tell you that of all of the reviews of Lee's 3 preprints, all of them unanimously were negative. So, okay, let me clarify on the outset here. There are 3 preprints: the burial, the art, and the you don't need big brains to do burial and art paper. And of those 3 preprints, there were 4 for the first 2 and 3 for the last one. So of 11 reviews, not a single one would have approved publication as is. All of them would have required minor to major revisions, if not outright rejection, as seen by the criticisms outlined in each and every review. Now, we're going to go through the reviews, don't worry about that, and there are a lot of them, as well as the author's response, because the way eLife publications work, at least under this model, after getting the reviews, the authors can choose to kind of retract and make revisions, or publish as is with a response. And I want to see if you can guess what Berger and colleagues decided to do. It was the response. They published with the response. They published the manuscripts as is, with a response. And I have thoughts on that too. If all of this sounds kind of crazy to you as far as an actual journal and the standards that they have for publication, like their process for publication, let me assure you, it was just as surprising to me and many of the folks who I was in the field with when all of this was going down initially. But they are doing this. They're changing how they look at publications, and we're going to look at their process right here, right now. So eLife is a journal. It's a science journal, much like many of the other science journals that you know and love, but they are kind of changing around how they do things. So eLife's peer review process. eLife is changing its editorial process to emphasize public reviews and assessments of preprints by eliminating accept to reject decisions after peer review. So this sends a lot of red flags up to me as somebody who's involved in science communication, the distillation of information from sort of the ivory towers of academia into a consumable format for folks who maybe aren't in academia. And the reason for this is because they're framing this as a very positive thing. They're making the review very transparent so anybody can see what reviewers have said and how the manuscript has or perhaps hasn't changed after getting reviewed by peers. But to me, this part right here, eliminating accept reject decisions after peer review, so they're basically saying we decide whether or not to accept or reject not on the basis of what other people in the field are saying, but by a different set of criteria that we'll go over in a second. This just puts the onus of assessing the robusticity of a given study, not on the scientific community, but on the reader. And to me, that feels kind of irresponsible, especially in the modern era of anti-intellectualism. This has a lot of faith in the average reader making their own informed decision after consuming both a manuscript and the peer review published alongside it. And me personally, I am very suspicious of that as an idea because no one can be informed in everything. I'm not even taking this as people might maliciously misuse certain publications that haven't been appropriately peer reviewed, although that will happen. I'm looking at this from a perspective of okay, I'm not a geology expert. If something is published in geology in eLife alongside the peer reviews, because I don't even have the basis in geology, post the undergraduate level, I'm not going to be able to read the manuscript and the peer review and then move on to make an informed decision without consuming just insane amounts of geology literature to get myself up to speed. And even at that point, I still lack the experience of being in the field for a prolonged period of time to understand the nuances and controversies, if they exist, that may be relevant to this manuscript and reviewer relationship. There's just a lot wrong with putting the onus on the reader instead of the journal and the reviewers. I think it actually, in a roundabout way, makes science more inaccessible to the average person. Because now, instead of experts in the field vetting the information before it's disseminated to the public as something that is rigorous enough to pass the bare minimum within a field, every interested layman has hours of homework to do, from big-scale concepts within the paper to the minutiae of the methodology within it, just in order to understand if there is in fact a contentious relationship, whether to trust the peer reviewers or the original author. So let's go over their process so that you can be just as disgruntled as I am. So submission is pretty straightforward. If you already have a preprint, you basically just give them the link to that, or you allow them to help you establish your preprint and post it so that people can have access to it quickly. I don't necessarily have a problem with preprints, to be honest. I think it's cool that we can see information like right when it's ready, right when they're ready to start the publication process. I think that allows people to get excited. I think that allows people to give their input on how things should change if they do change. The only problem is when you have a preprint that's submitted, everybody says, no, don't publish it as is, and then it gets published as is, or at least that's potentially a problem that I see. So after they've got your preprint, they're going to send it for peer review. Editors select the submissions that are going to be sent for peer review, blah, 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 blah. So here's the peer review section. Reviewers are asked to write a public review that comments on the strengths and weaknesses of the preprint and on whether the claims and conclusions are justified by the data. Reviewers also provide recommendations for the authors, including suggestions for revisions and improvements. Okay, cool. Like that's pretty standard for peer review. The eLife assessment. During the review process, editors and reviewers will discuss the reviews with each other and assess the significance of the findings and strength of the evidence reported in the preprint. Their conclusions are captured in an eLife assessment, which is written with the help of a common vocabulary to ensure consistency. So this is basically how they're getting around the whole we're not necessarily going to take the peer reviewer's advice. They're saying we're going to put a little bar at the top that's like, hey, here's your disclaimer, here's what the reviewer said, in sort of a single distilled paragraph, like an abstract, but for all of the peer reviewers combined. One thing I do like about this is that the editors and reviewers discuss with one another. I think that's always good. Here's another little suspicious thing here, the publication fee. The publication fee for publishing with eLife will be reduced from $3,000 to $2,000, charged at the point we commit to peer reviewing the work. So they're saying it's reduced from $3,000 to $2,000, which I guess is good, but this is still really expensive. And the vibe on Twitter, paleo Twitter that I got, and academic Twitter that I got, is that this is reading to a lot as like a pay to win. You know, you pay the fee and you get your thing published regardless of whether or not it passes peer review, but they will put a stamp up at the top that's like, here's what the reviewer said, as summarized. So the reviewed preprint. Under this new approach, eLife will no longer accept or reject decisions or make accept or reject decisions following peer review. Instead, every article selected for peer review will be published as a reviewed preprint on the eLife website. This will include the preprint itself along with the eLife assessment, public reviews, and, if the author wishes, a response from the authors. Author revisions. Upon receiving the reviews, the authors decide whether or not to proceed with a version of record or undertake revisions. If the author would like us to consider a revised version, they will need to update their preprint. Updates to peer reviews and assessments. We will consider whether to re-review revised preprints and update our assessment and the public reviews as needed. The recommendations for the author and author responses are also included in a revised, reviewed preprint. And then there's the version of record. When authors are satisfied with the process, the process is complete, they can request that the current reviewed preprint becomes the version of record. So basically, which one do they want to be the version that eLife has as like, this is the final manuscript. And then they say, published with another journal. We hope authors will proceed with the eLife version of record. If not, they're still welcome to submit their research for publication with another journal. So there is their process. You can see it's pretty rough. You know, I don't like it personally. I don't think that this is a good thing for science communication. I like open access as a concept. I really like the idea of publishing peer reviews with a manuscript, but what I don't like is not taking peer review into consideration for accept and reject. I think that kind of defeats the purpose of peer review in the first place. And like, I get what eLife is going for here. The idea is, let's make things more transparent. Let's make the process transparent to the reader. But you can do that and still have an accept-reject criteria based off of peer review. You could publish the manuscript as it was initially submitted, as well as with every revision and what the peer reviewer said, and I think that would be really great, to be perfectly honest. Of course, it's asking a lot of peer reviewers, I think, but I think overall, this would be really good for science. The problem is that you pay a fee, and regardless of what the peer reviewers say, that manuscript can be published as is. And the reason we're going over all of this is because it is extremely relevant to the Homanaletti conversation. So here was the first preprint that we went over in the previous video, the one that I said I thought had the best support for it, the one that seemed to make a lot of sense to me, somebody who doesn't study burials. It's called Evidence for Deliberate Burial of the Dead by Homanaletti. And I think we're gonna go over this again with this added context of eLife as well as with the reviews and assess for ourselves what the overall picture looks like for Homanaletti. We're gonna do this for this one, and we're also gonna do it for the engravings. So we've already gone through this paper, but I'm going to reread the abstract again to refresh everybody's memory and also to kind of set the stage for the peer reviews. And then we're going to finish things off with this paper with the eLife assessment to see how accurately it captures the opinions of the reviewers. So the abstract first and foremost, and we'll skip the eLife assessment for now. Abstract. Recent excavations in the Rising Star Cave system of South Africa have revealed burials of extinct hominin species Homanaletti. A combination of geological and anatomical evidence shows that hominins dug holes that disrupted the subsurface stratigraphy and interred the remains of Homanaletti individuals, resulting in at least two discrete features within the Dinaledi chamber and the hill antechamber. So this is definitive language, right? The evidence shows that hominins dug holes that disrupted the subsurface stratigraphy and interred the remains of other individuals. These are the most ancient interments yet recorded in the hominin record, earlier than evidence of Homo sapiens interments by at least 100,000 years. These interments, along with other evidence, suggest that diverse mortuary practices may have been conducted by Homanaletti within the cave system. These discoveries show that mortuary practices were not limited to Homo sapiens or other hominins with large brain sizes. So the language is really important here. It's something that we didn't appreciate in the previous video. And let's move on to the peer review tab, which is available right here. So, editors George Perry and George Perry, same guy, and reviewer number 1 for public review. Let's begin. The discovery of Homanaletti fossils and the Rising Star Cave system is unquestionably important for paleoanthropology. The fossils themselves hold a wealth of information about the diversity and complexity of morphological and evolutionary change on the hominid family tree. It is truly an amazing find, an important site, and it is important that information about this site continues to be produced so that more can be known. It is equally important that the papers produced from this site be fully reviewed for scientific rigor. I hope to assist with this to the best of my ability. That's called foreshadowing. In its current form, the paper, Evidence for the Deliberate Burial of the Dead by Homanaletti, does not meet the standards of our field. The paper is hard to follow. It lacks key citations, contextual background information to inform the reader about the geological and depositional structure of the caves, and concise, understandable descriptions of the methods and the significance of the results. This physically hurts to read. That is an absolute slam dunk roast as far as academic standards go, and really as far as general standards go as well. The main point of the paper is to describe 3 possible burial features. The working hypothesis is that the features are intentional burials, and the authors seek to support this hypothesis throughout rather than test it. So this is the kind of language that is super problematic that we saw in the abstract, and it's something that I didn't point out in the previous video on this subject. But when you reread it now with the context of these reviews, you'll see that, yeah, like this does hold to be the case, right? They are starting with the conclusion first and working backwards. That's the argument that all 4 of these reviewers make, and I personally, upon rereading the preprint, can see their point. The authors do this by noting mineralogical differences in the sediment and possible bowl-shaped sedimentological distinctions where fossil bones occur. As stated above, this evidence needs to be elaborated on in text, contextualized, and edited for clarity. In addition, throughout the paper, the authors only considered 2 depositional scenarios for burial and body decomposition. Number 1, the body was intentionally buried in a pit that was dug into the cave sediments and then buried in sediment, without detailing in the main text what sediment was used to backfill the pit. And number 2, the body was left in a natural pit and decayed out in the open. So I'm going to stop here and there and give my own opinion of the statements in these reviews. The paper being hard to follow, lacking key citations, contextual background information to inform the reader about the geological and depositional structure of the caves, and concise, understandable descriptions of the methods as well as the significance of the results. This sentiment here is going to be echoed in all 4 of the reviews. And something that I couldn't appreciate, because again, I don't study burials, is this little section right here. It lacks key citations. There's an excellent YouTuber named Flint who is an archaeologist, so he studies specifically burials of like non-human animals and humans alike, and he touches on the lack of key citations in an excellent video that I'm going to be bringing up points from quite a few times in this video here because it's so good. It's titled Homanaletti Burial, a public peer review of the evidence, again by Archaeology with Flint. This got a retweet by Chris Stringer, so you know it's legit. I've never been retweeted by Chris Stringer, so that should just give you an idea as to how good this video is. It also meets my seal of approval because it's almost over an hour and a half, which is the only appropriate length of a video, to be perfectly honest. But he touches on this, that it lacks key citations. Being somebody who studies burials, he was quickly able to identify who should have been cited at certain portions of the text, who simply wasn't. The reviewer goes on to say, a major problem with only considering these 2 scenarios for body decomposition is that previous reports about cave geology and sedimentology show that it is a dynamic system involving erosion, sediment slumping, and drainage, and that contraction of clay, which is a major component of the sediment, etc., is at play. The authors are very clear that flooding is not a viable option for the movement of skeletal elements in the cave. However, they do not mention other processes such as erosion or sediment slumping that are known to occur and could be responsible for moving sediment and fossils in each chamber of the cave. They also do not consider carnivore involvement, which has been suggested by Val 2016 and Egeland et al. 2018. So my opinion on this is, like, I and others, Flint mentions this has been touched on Twitter by other paleoanthropologists as well, but like the idea that the carnivores are involved here seems pretty unlikely. Again, it's difficult to get back into this cave, and Homanaletti is the only thing there. So unless we're dealing with like, Predator has come to Earth and is explicitly hunting Homanaletti and like his base is in the Denali cave system, I don't think carnivore involvement is going to be, a major hypothesis considered at play here. There's also like no carnivore marks on the bones. Like, it doesn't look like they've been gnawed on or chewed on, which is pretty typical for carnivores being at play. But sediment slumping and erosion do occur in the cave, and as noted by the reviewer here, such processes could naturally transport bodies, shift them around, and sediment erosion could bury them. So what the reviewer here is saying is that the authors presented 2 hypotheses. The bodies were intentionally buried, or they just decayed on the surface of the cave. Well, what if they were buried but not intentionally? What if they ended up in the belly of the cave system and then were buried by natural processes occurring within the cave? This is an idea that, according to this reviewer, was not tested. So they go on to say, the accumulation of some skeletal elements, articulation of some skeletal elements is a major argument for intentional burial. So this is what they're saying the authors are proposing is maybe a reason as to why they don't have to consider natural burial as an option here. That some of the skeletal elements are still in articulation, so they're still touching. However, within the cave substructure, articulated bones are often commingled with disarticulated elements from the same or different individuals. This same situation exists in the features included in this paper. It does appear that some skeletal material was covered in sediment before decomposition and remains in articulation, but bodies decompose at different rates and can decompose slowly, especially in environments that lack insects. Wiersma et al. Described the cave system as very humid but dry due to little standing water, mildly acidic with an average temperature today of 18 degrees Celsius and a minimum of 12 degrees Celsius over the last million years. The starting null hypothesis should be that the bodies were naturally covered in sediment. Intentional burial requires extraordinary circumstances and requires multiple solid lines of evidence to support the hypothesis. In testing for natural burial processes, the rate of body decomposition should be reconstructed given the environmental parameters of the cave. Wiersma et al. Described the cave system as very humid but dry due to little standing water, mildly acidic with an average temperature today of 18 degrees Celsius and a minimum of 12 degrees Celsius over the last million years. The starting null hypothesis should be that the bodies were naturally covered in sediment. Intentional burial requires extraordinary circumstances and requires multiple solid lines of evidence to support the hypothesis. In testing for natural burial processes, the rate of body decomposition should be reconstructed given the environmental parameters of the cave. So they're basically saying, this reviewer, that the authors tested the idea of intentional burial against the idea of decomposing on the surface, and what do the remains better indicate? And the problem, as pointed out by the reviewer here, is that dismisses anything in between those two hypotheses. So let me present a hypothetical here. So if I've got this little cartoon illustration of the naledi chamber, and I'll move myself over here so you can see better. So here's the entrance up here on the upper right, and there on the lower left is sort of deeper into the cave system. So what if we had a situation like this? An individual ends up falling into the naledi chamber. Maybe they were thrown there after they were already dead by a conspecific, another member of their group. Maybe they were running from a predator and hid in the cave and stumbled into the dark zone and then fell down into this chamber where they promptly died. Either way, you end up with a body right here, sort of on the right end of the cave system, maybe slumping up against this wall. Well, as the cave sort of periodically gets wet, right, this sediment underneath the body is going to get looser and softer and erode away, and the body may end up tumbling partially down this slow slope here towards one of the drains that are in the belly of the cave system, right? The body's just going to naturally move and shift around because of the wetness of this cave. And as it does so, the body is already decomposing. So some things may end up being still together by the time the body ends up down here by the excavation zone, while other things that are maybe in easier to decompose or faster to decompose portions of the body aren't. So you're going to end up with some elements that are already in articulation. They're going to stay in articulation by the time they're buried by more sediment continuing to slump down this hill as the cave system continues to erode, and some that aren't. That's a great example of how you can get some things in articulation and other things not in articulation as things roll down this hill due to the natural processes within the cave. And that would also explain why there's other individuals commingled here, especially if we're looking at a situation where individuals are just kind of tossing their dead down into this cave. They end up buried. There is a funerary or mortuary practice at play here, but the individuals Homanaletti aren't squirming down into this cave system lit by fiery torches as they dig a pit and place their dead into it and then, put sediment on top of them. And what's interesting about that scenario I just described is that it was described first by Lee and colleagues in their initial 2015 paper under the section titled Deliberate Disposal, which was the first time that they ever proposed burial or intentional funerary practices by Homanaletti as a means by which all the individuals ended up in the cave in the first place. And this paper is open access, and it's titled Geological and Taphonomic Context for the New Hominin Species Homanaletti from the naledi Chamber in South Africa. So moving back down to the section where we discuss deliberate disposal amongst all of the other ideas that are proposed to be the reason as to why all these individuals end up down here. So they discuss mass fatality, or death trap, predator accumulation, water transport, occupation, and they manage to explain why each of these is pretty unlikely. And then they get down to the deliberate disposal section, which is sort of left as the only option, even all the way back then in 2015. They say in the deliberate body disposal hypothesis, bodies of individuals found in the cave would have either been carried into or dropped through an entrance similar to, if not the same as, the one presently used to enter the naledi chamber. So remember that cartoon we just looked at. If individuals were dropped either whole or in part into the present entrance chute into the chamber, then physical entry would not be required. So they wouldn't need fire, they wouldn't need to shimmy into these hard-to-reach areas of the chamber. None of the bone elements studied show evidence of green fracture, so indicating a lack of trauma. So they're not fractured in a way that looks like they were just careening down into the bottom. So therefore, if bodies were dropped down into the entrance, it is unlikely that they would have fallen rapidly or landed with any force, perhaps because the entry is too irregular and narrow to allow a body to free fall and gain speed. So basically there's clink, 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 clink down this rough chute. It's quite gruesome to imagine, but, potential solution here, potential explanation here. Or perhaps because a pile of soft, muddy sediment had accumulated below the entryway, breaking the momentum of any falling object. Note that accessing the entry point to the chamber to drop bodies down into the chute would have still entailed a complex climb into the dark zone. In this scenario, the distribution of skeletal material as well as the evidence for partial articulation could be explained by the slow slumping of fleshed or semi-fleshed remains downslope into the chamber. So, this is what I just presented as an idea because it's Lee's idea, but this was not, to my understanding, tested within the deliberate burial paper. So the reviewer continues saying, in keeping with supporting their starting hypothesis that Homanaletti intentionally buried individuals in the cave, the authors conclude that, and then they go on to quote the paper, a parsimonious explanation for this configuration of skeletal remains is that the remains may be a palimpsests, of burials that have sequentially disrupted each other. In this hypothesis, early burials were disrupted when pits were dug for subsequent burials. Other occurrences of remains outside the Dinaledi chamber and Hill antechamber are discussed as possible evidence of mortuary practices in Supplementary Information 4.1. Instances where parts of individuals occur in remote, narrow passageways cannot be explained as a result of carnivore or water transport, making it necessary to consider that Homanaletti may have placed these partial remains in these locations, potentially representing a form of funeral caching. So funeral caching, again, is the idea that you're just getting rid of the dead because they're gross and you don't want them in your living area. Ants do this, other animals do this, and this would be an example of what I mentioned earlier, where it's like you're just tossing them down into the cave to get rid of them. Then the reviewer ends the quote and says, after reviewing the evidence presented in the current manuscript, it is not clear why this is a parsimonious explanation. The authors have repeatedly described how incredibly challenging it is to get into and out of this cave system and all of its chambers. How could any species, even small-bodied species, drag, pull, shove dead bodies through small crevices, shove or drop them down a narrow chute, and continue to move through the Hill antechamber to the Dinaledi chamber to bury bodies? It is not impossible, but given the previously published descriptions of the dynamic process of sedimentation movement in the cave, it is certainly not a parsimonious explanation. To support this, it will take many more lines of evidence than presented here, such as a micromorphological analysis of the overall cave system in each feature, discussed in the supplementary information but only briefly, full detailed reconstruction of the sediment, water, fossil, and debris movement through the cave system, coupled with reconstructions of body decomposition rates. Scientifically precise computer-generated reconstructions of all of this are possible working with specialists affiliated with the National Geographic Society. An analysis also needs to start by testing a null hypothesis, not deciding on a conclusion and setting out to prove it. Ouch. Okay, so basically to summarize this first review, the reviewer felt that Lieberger and colleagues started with the conclusion first, that Homanaletti buried its dead, and then worked backwards, and in doing so did not test all of the alternative hypotheses that could have resulted in the data that's currently seen there in the Dinaledi chamber and the Hill antechamber. Is it possible that you can get that type of preservation by some other means other than deliberate burial? They have not ruled out all the other options, and that's the big problem, according to this reviewer. You can't start with the conclusion first and work backward. They feel that there are indeed many, many more additional tests that need to be run in order to conclude that these are in fact burials. Critically, though, the reviewer doesn't say that they aren't. The reviewer says that more work needs to be done in order to show that this is in fact the case, and that, generally speaking, the manuscript sucks as is and shouldn't be published, which they did so using a lot of really harsh language that you really only see in academia if the state of affairs is really bad. So let's move on to the next reviewer. So reviewer number 2 starts by summarizing what went down in the manuscript, and then says that Dinaledi Feature 1 consists of a collection of 108 skeletal elements recovered from Subunit 3B deposits. These remains are believed to be primarily representative of a single adult individual, along with at least one additional juvenile individual, so there's a mixing of two individuals going on here. Although additional anatomical elements associated with Dinaledi Feature 1 are mentioned, they are not described as they remain unexcavated, so that's a critical portion right there. these burials, these proposed burials, are not completely excavated. The study states that the spatial arrangement of the skeletal remains is indicative of primary burial of a fleshed body. On the other hand, naledi feature 2 is not extensively discussed, and its complete extent was not thoroughly investigated. So this is problematic, right? Because you're saying we have naledi feature 1 and naledi feature 2, and they're both burials. But as noted by this reviewer here, only one of them was actually discussed in great detail, and even that one is unexcavated. The other one is not discussed really very much at all. It's not been thoroughly investigated. They say regarding the hill antechamber feature, it was divided into 3 separate plaster jackets for removal from the excavation. So they basically took feature 3, the hill antechamber proposed burial, jacketed it in plaster, and removed it so that they could CT scan it outside of the cave system. There were a total of 90 skeletal elements and 51 dental elements that were identified, and from this data, 3 individuals were identified, along with a 4th individual described as significantly younger. Individuals 1 and 2 are classified as juveniles. The reviewer says, I feel that there is a significant amount of missing information in the study presented here, which fails to convince me that the human remains described primarily represent primary burials, i.e. singular events where the bodies are placed into their final resting places. Insufficient evidence is provided to differentiate between natural processes and intentional funerary practices. So this is interesting too, because I think that funeral caching, so chucking the bodies down in there, is kind of like a nice happy medium between these two things. The funerary practice may be chucking the individuals, and the natural processes might be the individuals resulting in being partially buried. In my opinion, the study should include a section that distinguishes between taphonomic changes and deliberate human modifications of the remains and their context, as well as reconstruct the sequence and timeline of events surrounding the death and deposition. So what actually happens to result in the bodies as we find them, in the remains as we find them today? A deliberate burial involves the complex series of changes, including the decomposition of soft tissues, disruption of articulations between bones, and the sequence of skeletonization. While the geological information is detailed, the Archaeo Thanatological, nailed it the first time, and I keep second guessing myself. See below, is largely absent, and when presented, it lacks clarity and unambiguousness. My main concern is that the study does not apply or cite the basic principles of Archaeo Thanatology, which combines taphonomy, anatomy, and knowledge of the human decomposition to interpret the arrangement of human bones within the naledi chamber and hill antechamber. So this is the same problem that was noted in the previous reviewer and by Flint in his video, which is that the citations are missing. And this is a really big claim, so you need to have all of your citations in order. It has been Archaeo Thanatology, so this is the study of how things die and preserve when they're buried, has been developed since the 1970s and has been widely used by archaeologists and osteologists to reconstruct various aspects such as the original treatment of the body, associated mortuary practice, and the sequence of body decomposition, and the factors influencing changes in the skeleton within the burial. So this may come as a shock to you, and it came as a little bit surprising to me, but we understand really well the difference between how a body looks when we discover it if it's been intentionally buried versus a myriad of different natural processes. And what this author is saying, what this reviewer is saying, is that not all of these were considered, as evidenced by the lack of citations. Specifically, the study lacks a description of the relative sequence of joint disarticulation during decomposition and the spatial displacement of the bones. A detailed assessment of the anatomical relationships of bones, both articulated and disarticulated, as well as the direction and extent of bone displacement, is missing. For instance, while it is mentioned that many elements are in articulation or sequential anatomical position, a comprehensive list of those articulated elements and their classification, as labile or not, is not provided. Furthermore, the patterns described are not illustrated in sufficient detail. If Homanaletti was deliberately buried, it would be crucial to present illustrations depicting the individuals in their burial positions, as well as the representation and proportions of the larger and smaller anatomical elements for each individual. So we know that Lee is capable of doing this because there's a really great burial position paper on Australopithecus sediba. Why didn't we get those guys on this job is a question that I have. While Figure 2b provides an overall view of naledi Feature 1, it is challenging to determine the relationships of the bones, whether articulated or disarticulated, in Figures 2c or 2d. Such information is essential to determine whether the bones are in primary or secondary position, differentiate between collective and multiple burials, and ascertain a body's stage of decomposition at the time of burial, identify postmortem and post-depositional manipulation of the body and grave, and establish whether burial occurred immediately after death or was delayed. So, like, what's crazy to me is, it's always crazy to me, is just how in-depth all fields are outside of my own. Why weren't these people consulted? Why weren't these concepts consulted? Is my question, again, for such a major claim as intentional burial. Moreover, the study does not address bone displacements within secondary voids created after the decomposition of soft tissues, nor does it provide assessments of the position of bones within or outside of the original body volume. Factors such as variations in soft tissue between individuals of different size and corpulence, as well as progressive filling, or delayed filling of secondary open spaces with sediment over time should also be discussed. In conclusion, while I acknowledge the importance of investigating potential deliberate burials in Homanaletti, I do not think in its present form the evidence presented in this study is as robust as it should be. So again, we have an individual who is reviewing the manuscript as presented by Lee, who is saying really cool stuff. Maybe it is a burial, but more work needs to be done to confirm or deny it. And then sort of a left open there, why wasn't this work done before this was submitted to be published? So the first reviewer looked primarily at sort of the geological context and alternative hypotheses for the burial. This second individual is clearly like an Archaeo Thanatologist who is looking at it from a perspective of, why are we not considering decomposition and the anatomical position of the bones and how they relate to one another, the different burials and the different remains, things of that nature? So we've got two experts coming at this from different opinions, both of which who give it a big ol' thumbs down. So let's consider reviewer number 3. The third reviewer again summarizes this situation. They note that this would be the oldest evidence of intentional burial. They say the main issue with the paper is that the purported burials were not fully excavated. 2 are still in the ground, and 1 was removed in blocks but left unexcavated. As burials are mostly about sediments, it means that the authors are lacking important lines of evidence. Instead, they bring other lines of argument as outlined below. While their preferred scenario is possible, so this is, again, a note that these aren't not burials. There are important issues with the evidence as presented, and they are severely hampered by their lack of detailed archaeological and geoarchaeological information, both from the specific skeletal context and more generally from the chamber, because in fact, the amount of excavation conducted here is still quite limited in scope. I also found that while the presentations of various specialists in the team was quite good, the integration of these contributions to the main text was not. In particular, the geology of the cave system and chamber need, especially what is known about the depositional and post-depositional processes, to be better integrated into the presentation of the archaeology and interpretation of the finds. So this is the one that I actually quite like the most about this review. I like this paragraph here where they discuss the nature of articulated remains, because this idea that remains remain articulated because they're buried is a line of evidence that is presented by Berger and colleagues that maybe isn't necessarily as straightforward as they would like it to be, as noted by this reviewer. Oftentimes, the presence of articulated or mostly articulated skeletons is used to argue for intentional burial. This argument, however, is based on the premise that if not buried, these skeletons would have otherwise become disarticulated. Normally, disarticulation happens as a result of subsequent use of the site by hominins, like purported burials in Neanderthal cave sites, or by carnivores scavenging the body. Indeed, this latter point is why bodies are buried so deeply in many Western societies, beyond the reach of the smell of carnivores. Bodies can be also disarticulated by natural processes of deposit and erosion. However, so this kind of sets the stage for, in a deep, dark cave system where carnivores can't get to bodies and disarticulate them, why is articulation being used as an argument for burial? However, here in the case of the naledi chamber, we apparently don't have any of these other processes. The chamber was not used by carnivores, and it is not a living area where Homanaletti would have frequently returned to and cleared out for space. As for depositional processes, it is more complex, but it is clear from Wiersma et al. That there is a steady, constant movement of these sediments towards the drains. They also think that the process can account for the mix of articulated and non-articulated elements in the cave. So they basically go on to note here, unless the team can provide a process that would have otherwise disarticulated these skeletons after the bodies arrived and decomposed, their articulated state is not evidence of burial, no more than finding an articulated or mostly articulated bear skeleton deep in a European cave would suggest that it was buried. I really like that argument and how it was laid out by the reviewer there, because this is clearly somebody who is involved in Archaeo Thanatology, who understands burials and the different processes that can interrupt or alter the state of decomposition of an individual. And like, this is also just something that I never would have considered, right? I mean, it seems so straightforward and clear-cut now that they mention it, but this is why it's so important to have folks who actually work in that field, in that specialty, weigh in on stuff like this. Because yeah, they're totally right. Articulation only works as an argument for intentional burial if the body would have otherwise been disarticulated if left alone just on the surface. But in the belly of the cave, it wouldn't really be, would it? So I don't know, I find that really compelling, and I hope you do too. Okay, so next they cover one of the things that I found to be the most compelling argument for the burial, which is that Lee and colleagues argue the sediment that surrounds the skeletons that are argued to be burials, that sediment is different from the sediment found elsewhere in the cave. Like, it clearly represents something that is discrete and unique to the area surrounding the bones. So it looks like it was infill. It looks like pit infill is the argument that Berger and colleagues make. And to me, a moron that doesn't study burials, that totally checks out. Like, yeah, how else would you get that? But this is, again, why you have the experts weigh in. As for the elemental analysis, what I understood from the paper, because, again, what they did is they basically tested the elemental composition of the sediments directly surrounding the bones in these burials as compared to elsewhere in the cave, and they found that they were different, with a big caveat that we're about to find out here. What I understood from the paper is that the sediment associated with bones is different from the sediment not associated with bones. Because what actually happened, you guys, and this is something that I didn't appreciate, also because I don't think, read the paper closely enough. I mostly read it slightly before we recorded the last video, and then we recorded the video, and then I left for Kenya, and it was kind of out of my mind for a while. But they tested the sediment surrounding the bones, the sediment from elsewhere in the cave, and then the sediment from other areas that have bones in them. And like, the areas that both had bones in them mapped with one another to the exclusion of non-bone bearing sediment. So the reviewer says, it is therefore unsurprising that the sediment associated with the reported skeletons, so the burials, clusters with sediments with bones. The linking argument for why this makes the sediment pit fill is unclear to me. Perhaps it is there, but as written, I did not follow. What the elemental analysis could suggest, I think, is that there has not been substantial reworking of the sediments as opposed to creep suggested by Wiersma et al. So they're arguing here, like the reviewers kind of helping Berger and colleagues along here and arguing that maybe the nature of the sediment being similar across these multiple spots that are fossiliferous may indicate that it hasn't been reworked by the slumping and the erosion. Since the bones leached these minerals into the sediment, because this is the critical portion, and Flint talked about it in his video too, and this is something that as a non-geologist and as a non-archaeologist I didn't know happens, but like, bones and sediment will like leach from each other when fossilization and also just regular interactions, especially when water is inundating the sediment, when those processes are going on. So basically, you're getting it's diagenesis. So you're getting calcium coming from the bones into the soil and making that soil that surrounds the bones distinct and unique as compared to sediment that doesn't have bones in them, right? So yes, that sediment would give the appearance that it is unique, but not because it's burial sediment, because there's leaching going on between the sediment and the soil. This is something that should have been tested, right? This needs to be squared away. The reviewer continues and says, what I don't know and what is not reported is how long after deposition we can expect the soil chemistry to change. If this elemental analysis were extended in a systematic way across the chamber, both vertically and horizontally, after more extensive excavations, I could see it perhaps being useful for a better understanding of the site formation processes and depositional context. As it is now, I do not see the argument in support of a burial pit. The other line of evidence here is that some bones are sediment supported. The argument argument here is that when a body decomposes, bones that were previously held in place by soft tissues will be free to move and will shift their position. How the bones shift will differ depending on whether the body is surrounded by matrix, as they argue here in an excavated burial pit, or whether it is in the open, say for example in a coffin. And there are other possibilities as well, for instance wrapped in a shroud. Experiments have also shown the order in which the tendons, for example, decompose, and therefore which bones are more likely to be free or move first or last. I will note that this literature is poorly cited. Again, this is the third reviewer who's noted this. I think only 2 papers cited for how bodies decompose are Rock-Sandick, 2002, and Mickelber and Westcott in 2019. The former is a review paper that summarizes a great many contexts that are clearly not appropriate here, and it generally makes the point that it is difficult to sort out, and it notes that progressively filled is an additional alternative to not buried or buried, and the other looks at experimental data of bodies decomposing without being buried. In the paper here, this citation is used to argue that the body must have been buried. I don't see the linking argument at all. That one is really problematic, right? So you're citing sources for your claims. You're saying, XYZ as noted by ABC, but ABC does not actually say anything in relation to XYZ, right? Like that is super bad scholarship. This is one of the first things that you learn when you're learning how to write like a scientist, is to make sure your citations are appropriate. So the reviewer spends a little bit more time talking about improvements to citations and figures and additional figures that might add some clarity, and then they cover the other of the primary arguments that I found was compelling with regard to the burial. They say one of the key pieces of evidence for demonstrating deliberate burial is the recognition of a pit. Pits can be identified because of the rupture they create in the stratigraphy when older sediments are brought out to the surface, mix, and then refilled into the pit with a different color, texture, and compaction. In some homogeneous sediments, a pit can be hard to detect, and in some instances, post-depositional processes, such as burrowing, can blur the distinction between the pit and the surrounding sediments. But the starting point of any discussion of deliberate burial has to be the demonstration of a pit. So again, what they're talking about here is like, let's say you have a bunch of sediment, lines of clay or different strata within the stratigraphy. A pit, like a hole that's dug to place a body in, should break all of those lines of strata, and then because the sediment is being dug down and pulled out, the body placed in, and then that infill being placed back, but all of the strata are now mixed together. So it's a clear break in the stratigraphy with a big commingling of all of the different sediments and sediment types. They're saying that the first thing you've got to do is show that there's a pit in the first place, and that has not evidently been done here. And I don't see it here, they say. It might just be that the figures need to be improved, but I'm skeptical because the team has taken the view that these finds can't be excavated. While I appreciate the scanning work done on the antechamber find, it is not the same as excavating. Same comment for features 1 and 2. In short, this is their conclusion here. My view is that they have an extremely interesting data set. That Homanaletti buried their dead here cannot be excluded based on the data, but neither is it supported here. My view is that this paper is premature and that more excavation and the use of geoarchaeological techniques, especially micromorphology, are required to sort this out or go a long way towards sorting it out. So again, we have a mention of micromorphology, and for the third time, we see, it might be burial, but they have not shown that it is in fact a burial. Alright, so the last reviewer, they start in the same way as all of the other reviews by summarizing the situation at hand, and they say thus the scientific rigor to validate the findings should be of the highest quality and thus provide clear documentation of intentional burial. In an attempt to meet these standards, the authors stated a series of tests that would support their hypothesis of intentional burials in the Rising Star cave system. So this is actually the section that I emphasized when I went over these preprints, or this particular preprint in my previous video. By Berger and colleagues, they can be quoted as saying, the key observations of these data are, number 1, the difference in sediment composition within the feature compared to the surrounding sediment. Number 2, the disruption of the stratigraphy. So these were the 2 things that I personally found most compelling, as mentioned in the previous video. Number 3, the anatomical coherence of the skeletal remains. Number 4, the matrix-supported position of some skeletal elements. And number 5, the compatibility of non-articulated material with the decomposition and subsequent collapse. Then the reviewer comes back in here. To find support for the first test, the authors collected sediment samples from various locations within the Rising Star cave system, including sediment from within and outside the naledi feature 1. However, And here come the bullet points. Number 1. The authors did not select sediment samples from within the hill antechamber feature, so the test was only used to assess Dinaledi feature number 1. Number 2, the sediment samples were analyzed using X-ray diffraction and X-ray fluorescence, and to test the mineralogy and chemistry of the samples from within and outside the features. The XRF results were presented as weighted percentages, not intensities, and no control source was reported. The weighted percentages were analyzed using a PCA analysis, while the particle size distribution was analyzed using Gratistat statistics package and the Folk and Ward method to summarize mean grain size, sorting, skewness, and kurtosis, in addition to the percentages of clay, silt, and sand in each sample. Number 3, the PCA results were reported solely on as a biplot without showing the PC scores projected into the loading space, which is unusual and does not present the data accurately. Instead, the authors present the scores of a single component, PC2 figure 3, because the authors interpreted this component as discretely delineating fossil-bearing sediments from sterile sediments based off of the positive loadings of P and S. However, the supplementary table reports that the XRF bulk chemistry showed a weighted percentage of minerals within each sample, SI Table 1, showing an absence of data for both Na and S. Since Na is at the lower end of detection limit, so that's salt for the method, and S seems to be absent from the list, so sulfur, the intentions of the authors for showing the inclusion of these elements in their PCA results is unclear. Given that this is the author's primary method for demonstrating burial, this issue is particularly concerning and requires additional attention. This is science or like reviewer talk for this is highly sus. Number 4, I think this is number 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, this is number 4. Regardless of the missing data, this reviewer attempted to replicate the XRF PCA results using the data provided in Supplementary Table 1 and was unsuccessful. So this reviewer, the one who's writing, the number 4 that we're reading now, tried to replicate the PCA analysis as done by Berger and colleagues using the reported data and couldn't get their results. That's really weird. The samples that were collected from within the feature, SB cluster, and with samples collected from the sterile sediments and other locations around the cave system. Thus, these results are not replicable as currently reported. Number 5, visual comparisons of sediment grain size, shape, and composition were qualitatively summarized. Grain size was plotted as a line graph and is buried as supplemental figure S13, showing sample by color and area, but these results do not distinguish samples from within the burial compared to outside the burial, as the authors state in the methods as the primary goal. So they do this with each and every one of the tests as outlined by Berger and colleagues. To test the second aim, the stratigraphy was primarily described in text. For Dinaledi Feature 1, the authors state that the layer around Feature 1 is continuous in profile immediately to the east of the feature, is disrupted in the sediment profile to the southern extent of the feature. Upon examination of Figure 3b, the image shows an incredibly small depiction of the south, profile view with an extremely large black box overlaying a large portion of the photograph containing a small 5 cm scale. So here's that figure that they're talking about, and here's why that's so weird. So here's figure 3b, right? So here's the lorm. So this is one of the principal strata, I guess, that they're talking about is broken and then incorporated into the burial. So here's the line, right? And then here it's dipping down, right? I'm assuming this is the area of burial here where it's kind of intermingled. It's broken here. And then there's just this random black box covering this entire section with the 5 centimeter scale here. And like, Flint covered this too, and when he covered it in his video, I was like, wait, what? And I went back to look at it, and I was like, oh my god, that is super weird. So the fact that the reviewer also noticed this, it doesn't even line up with the box. Like, it's not even a line. It's just weird. It's just very strange. And worth considering what's going on here. Visually, there's no difference in profile that would suggest a description or a disruption in the form of the pit. The lorm does seem to become fragmentary, but no micromorphological analysis was conducted on this section to provide an evaluation of the stratigraphic composition. Also, by only excavating a portion of this feature, the authors were unable to adequately demonstrate the full extent of this feature. So really weird with the extremely large black box overlaying a large portion of the photograph. It's just a Tim Allen kind of moment, you know? The authors attempt to describe a bowl-shaped concave layer of glass and sediment-free voids that make up the bottom of the feature. Basically, they just go on and on roasting the paper. I'm not going to go over all of it because that would just be me reading it to you and chuckling nervously to myself, so I'll let you guys handle that. But this one is of note. Since this reviewer is unable to understand the fifth test as it was written by the authors, I am unable to comment on the evidence to support this test and will default to the other reviewers for evaluation of this claim. Remember that all of the reviewers were like, this is kind of hard to follow, and also this author couldn't replicate the PCA analysis, which is very strange. In addition to the lack of evidence to support the claim of intentional burials, this paper was also extremely poorly written. For example, the authors often overused persuasive communication devices, see eLife article here, to mislead readers. Quote, during this excavation, we recognized that developing evidence was suggestive of a burial due to spatial configuration of the feature and the evidence that was excavated, the evidence that the excavated material seemed to come from a single body, page 5. As an opening statement to introduce naledi feature 1, the authors state that the interpretation and working hypothesis as a fact before the authors present any evidence. This is known as harking and gives the impression that a hypothesis was formulated before data were collected. This type of writing is persuasive throughout the manuscript and requires extensive editing. I recommend that the authors review the article provided by eLife, so they're citing eLife to be like, don't do this, and carefully review the manuscript. Moreover, as this text demonstrates, the author's word choice is indicative of storytelling for a popular news article instead of a scientific paper. I highly suggest that the authors review the manuscript carefully and present the data prior to giving conclusions in a clear and concise manner. Moreover, the writing structure is inconsistent. Information that should be included in the results is included in the methods, text and the results that should be in the discussion, and so forth. This inconsistency is pervasive, Freudian slip, throughout the entire manuscript, making it incredibly difficult to adequately understand what the authors had done and how the results were interpreted. Finally, the artifact that was described in visualizing using CT models is just that, a digitally colored model. The object in question has not been analyzed. So basically, to fill you in, when they CT scanned the antechamber feature 1, there was like a rock that was kind of close to the individual that they're potentially proposing as is like a grave good, if you will. Very tentatively, they don't use that kind of language, but what the reviewer here is saying is that it's not even that at this point. It's just a digitally colored model. Until this object is removed from the dirt and physically analyzed, this information needs to be removed from the manuscript as there's nothing to report before the object is physically examined. Overall, there is not enough evidence to support the claim that Homanaletti intentionally buried their dead inside the Rising Star cave system. Unfortunately, the manuscript in its current condition is deemed incomplete and inadequate and should not be viewed as finalized scholarship. So, like I said, all 4 reviews are negative for this burial paper. All 4 of them are like, yeah, they might be burials, but we wouldn't know because the appropriate tests have not been done yet. And also the paper's poorly written and poorly cited. So anyways, here's where I would read the author response, because Berger and colleagues responded to the reviewers, as I mentioned earlier, and then that response was included with the peer review and the manuscript. And then the plan would be to go over the author reply to the burial paper, followed by doing the same process with the engravings paper and the summary paper with Fuentes. Except we can't do that, because Berger and colleagues' reply to the criticisms as levied by the peer reviewers, it's the same reply for all 11 reviews. Yep, one big long reply to 11 distinct criticisms. So what we're going to do is we're going to move on to the art paper, to the engravings paper, and then we're going to actually cover the summary paper as well. And then we're going to read the author reply and see how well it stacks up to the criticisms levied against all 3 manuscripts. Okay, so here is the next paper. 241,000 to 335,000-year-old rock engravings made by Homanaletti in the Rising Star Cave System, South Africa. Lee is the first author again. So what we're going to do is we are going to read the abstract just like we did for the previous paper, and because we kind of went over it last time, and because, as I said last time, this paper is basically just a description of the artifact in question, the potential artifact in question, which is these panels that have the engravings on them. And then we'll move on to the peer review. So, the production of painted, etched, or engraved designs on cave walls or other surfaces is recognized as a major cognitive step in human evolution. Such intentional designs, which are widely interpreted as signifying, recording, and transmitting information in a durable manner, were once considered exclusive to late Pleistocene Homo sapiens. Recent work has demonstrated that other hominin groups have also made such marks, including Neanderthals and possibly Middle Pleistocene Homo erectus. Such durable signs indicate an intentionality characteristic of meaning-making, which has been argued to require significant levels of cognitive ability not found in species with smaller brain sizes. In fact, the evolution of such meaning-making symbols is thought to be a core aspect of what it means to be, quote-unquote, human. Here we present the first known example of abstract patterns and shapes engraved within the naledi subsystem of Rising Star Cave in South Africa. So, the first known example of abstract patterns and shapes engraved within the naledi subsystem. So again, we're using really affirmative, definitive language. Like, in the abstract here, it's not proposed, geometric shapes and patterns, proposed engravings, suggested engravings, potential engravings. It is the first known example of abstract patterns and shapes, and it is by Homanaletti, proposed to be by Homanaletti. We identified markings incised into the dolomitic limestone walls of the caves. The engravings described here are deeply impressed cross-hatchings and other geometric shapes. The surface bearing these engravings appears to have been prepared and smoothed. In some areas, there is residue that creates a sheen on the surface, possibly indicating repeated handling or rubbing of the rock, and there is evidence of application of dirt or sand to the surface by non-natural processes. Homanaletti entered this part of the cave system and buried bodies within both the naledi chamber and the adjacent hill antechamber between 241 and 335,000 years ago. The engravings described here are found on a pillar in the hill antechamber that extends into the natural fissure corridor that links the two chambers, and we associate them with Homanaletti. So this is like the only tentative part here. We associate them with Homanaletti, but also they're just appreciating it as a given that Homanaletti buried its dead. And as we talked about in the previous paper, with the reviews in mind, this is not as definitive as perhaps Berger and colleagues would like, and as I would like. So I mentioned earlier that when the reviews for these preprints came out, I was doing field work in West Kenya, and I was surrounded by a lot of really knowledgeable people, and I was also, I had the pleasure of meeting even more knowledgeable people when we came back to the museum, and I talked to one individual who, upon discussing the preprints, and specifically these engravings, what I said to them was, at least what we can know is that they are engravings, even if we don't have dates for them yet, even if we can't definitively associate them with Homanaletti, because again, while Homanaletti is the only hominin other than humans that has been in that cave, there still is some definitive work that needs to be done that's going to actually associate them with Homanaletti, basically dating the cave art to show that this cave art was made at the same time that Homanaletti was occupying the cave system, or at least living around the cave system. And the individual I was talking to said, yeah, they look like engravings. And then they said, you should Google dolomitic elephant skin, or elephant skin dolomite. And I was like, why? And they were like, just do it. And this is what I found. So first on the right here, you can see the engravings in the Rising Star Cave system. A lot of cross-hatching. Again, to me, somebody who doesn't study ancient art, I can't think of any other way, and I said this in the previous video, I can't think of any other way that you could get markings like these other than a hominin or something capable of holding a stone tool, walking up and, drawing lines on walls. And humans are known for this. Other hominins are known for this. We like to scrape things on walls, to show, hey, I was here. And then I Googled the dolomitic limestone, or the elephant skin dolomite. And this is what it looks like. Now, when you compare these two, right, these two pictures to one another, elephant skin dolomite is a natural process that can get the type of cross-hatchings, or at least similar cross-hatchings, to what we see on the wall, superficially at least, in the Rising Star Cave system. And, my question is, immediately when this happened I was like, oh my God, did we rule this out? And then my second question was, what kind of rock is in the Rising Star Cave system? What kind of rock are these etchings inscribed into? And to move back to our burial paper here, our art paper here, you can see that it says we identified markings incised into dolomitic limestone the dolomitic limestone walls of the cave. So then my next thought was, oh my God, how did we rule out that this was, like, how did the authors rule out that this is elephant skin dolomite? And fortunately, they do cover it. So in this section titled Evidence of Hominid Manufacture of Engravings on panel A, it begins, dolomite is known for a pattern of natural weathering that results in patterns of recessed linear features on its surface. Awesome. I'm really glad to see this because, like, at this point, after going over the peer reviews and then hearing this from, you know, somebody who I respect quite a bit, I was like, oh my God, another thing. Like, is it really possible that, like, Lee and colleagues proposed that the elephant skin dolomite is actually engravings? But I'm glad they went over this. This was really good. Artificial markings can be distinguished from this natural weathering pattern in several ways. Natural fissures and erosional features in weathered dolomite surfaces are characteristically deeper than several millimeters and follow the natural fracture patterns and planes within the rock. Artificial lines are limited in depth and extent due to the natural hardness of dolomite. This hardness means that any substantial artificial marking requires multiple parallel incisions with a hard tool. Natural erosional features in dolomite may have variable cross-sections, ranging from beveled to U-shaped to rectangular in cross-section, but do not have multiple parallel striations visible within them. Where artificial engraved markings intersect, they often exhibit an ordering in which one was completed before the other. This kind of feature is not typical of natural weathering. In previous work, researchers have noted the limited depth of artificial lines, their composition from multiple parallel striations, and their association into clear arrangement or patterns as evidence of hominid manufacture. And they cite Fernando Halvo et al. 2014. Now, again, to be clear, I'm not an expert on ancient art or anything like that, but this section here in the text that talks about how the natural erosional features, so elephant skin dolomite, may have variable cross-sections ranging from beveled to U-shaped to rectangular in cross-section, but do not have multiple parallel striations visible within them. But, like, I feel like they do. I mean, here I am arguing on vibes here, right? Very creationist of me. But, like, looking at this elephant skin dolomite, I do see multiple parallel striations. I see ladder patterns. I see rectangular patterns. So I think what it comes down to is sort of the methodology of distinguishing, like, weathering depth and things of that nature that they spoke about. And they elaborate here. The engraved lines in panel A have each of these features that can clearly be distinguished from natural weathering of the surrounding dolomite walls, which can be seen adjacent to the panel within 20 centimeters of the nearest artificial marks. So they're saying we see normal elephant skin dolomite, or at least normal weathering of this dolomitic limestone, nearby the panels of proposed engravings, but the engravings are clearly distinct. The features produced by natural weathering are deeper than 10 millimeters, in particular deep relative to the feature width. They maintain a consistency of size and depth across substantially undulating or rugged surfaces. They expand from natural cracks and fissures. In contrast, even the widest of the engraved lines that constitute panel A have a relatively shallow depth. So, you know, this does make sense to me, right? The weathering is going to achieve a deeper depth because it's just consistent forces of nature over time, whereas with a hominin, they're just going to kind of shallowly scrape. That checks out as far as what I can understand. High resolution macrophotography shows microstriations constituting several of these engraved lines, in which roughly parallel incisions sometimes overlap with each other. Many of these lines also fall outside of the direction of natural fracture features in the country rock, although it should be recognized that there are multiple places on this panel where natural lines and features of the rock may have been enhanced by artificial engraving. And then some of the figures show where engraved lines intersect, having been clearly completed before the other. So, like, this, I think, is a good example of something that I can't imagine being done, like, being found in, like, dolomitic limestone, like, the way that it's carved in kind of an angle here, and you can see that the ends are shallower than the middle. But again, I'm not an expert on art. And, like, for me, I'm getting a sort of deja vu moment here. Move myself over here. There you go. I'm getting sort of a deja vu moment because I felt the same way about the burial paper, right? Like, Lee and colleagues are stating all of these characteristics of the burial paper. And then, as we discussed in the previous video, like, some of those claims just turned out not to hold any water when the actual experts were consulted. So, for instance, Lee cites in the previous burial paper at one point how his Homanaletti burials meet the bare minimum criteria for, like, archaic Homo sapiens burials, and then he cites the author. But then the author comments in an interview conducted by, I think it was Ann Gibbons' article, but I can't actually remember. And she was like, yeah, but they don't. They don't actually meet the criteria that I set out. And I know because I read the preprint. And it's like, okay, like, so it's one thing for Lee to say it, for Lee and colleagues to say it, and it's another thing for it to actually pan out when, you know, the authors of the criteria, for example, get a look at it. So I think at this point it would be a good idea to look at the reviews. Because to me, I think that as far as I can tell, they've done a decent job here distinguishing these engravings from elephant skin dolomite, but I want to see what the experts say, or rather I want to see what they say with you as my witness. So let's move on over to that. Okay, so beginning with reviewer number 1 here. So they begin with appreciating that the goal of the paper wasn't necessarily to do like a full series of tests on the engravings and was actually mostly meant to announce the discovery. But they do say that there's a little bit of suggestion going on here, made a few tentative identification, but then clearly acknowledged that a lot more documentation, sampling, and study would be needed before we can understand the full scope and potential importance of this find. They also describe the marks as what appear to be intentionally made marks, which to me suggests that the reviewer buys the tentative identification of these as hominin markings. They go, this is a big claim. If it proves to be true, it has the potential to be paradigm shifting, as the identification of intentional engraved marks made by a small-brained, distant human cousin of 200,000 plus years in South Africa would completely change our understanding of where, when, and who made the first graphic marks. 20 years ago, this claim would have probably been dismissed out of hand as being too far-fetched to be taken seriously. But there have been some major shifts in the field in recent years in regard to the age of the art and the identification of artists. That means this is a claim that should be approached with a scientifically cautious but open mind. Now there's mounting evidence for Neanderthals and potentially other closely related species as well to have been engaging in similar art-making practices to our own Homo sapiens ancestors. What makes this particular claim so extraordinary is that these marks are some of the oldest in the world, and that Homanaletti is a more distant relation with a smaller brain. This also is what makes the further study of this discovery such a fascinating exercise in scientific inquiry. From a technological and methodological perspective, there is an excellent range of tools and technologies that can be used to study these engravings. So I have no doubt that further studies will help answer some of the nuts and bolts questions. There's also an opportunity created by the discovery to really open a broader dialogue in the field about who were the first artists and at what point does the hominin brain become primed for making visual marks. I look forward to all sorts of lively debates in the future and to seeking the results of further in-depth studies. So this reviewer very succinctly said, big if true, but there is not enough to say much at this point other than that they do appear to buy tentatively that these are in fact hominin markings. So reviewer number 2 says patterns scored or painted onto durable media have long been considered important markers of the cognitive capabilities of hominins. More specifically, the association of such markers with Homo sapiens has been used to argue that our evolutionary success was in part shaped by our unique ability to code, store, and convey information through abstract conventions. So this is important, right? It isn't just that modern humans, make markings, like we draw what we see, but it's also that we make abstract markings that don't mean anything in and of themselves, but convey meaning due to a mutually understood relationship between symbol and what that symbol implies. Like the letter A doesn't mean right? It's just, it's a symbol that conveys cultural information to everybody who knows that A means That's the sound. That singularity of association has been cast into doubt within the last decade, with finds of designs apparently painted or carved by Neanderthals and potentially by even earlier hominins. Even allowing for these developments, however, extending the capability to generate putatively abstract designs to a relatively small-brained hominin like Homanaletti is contentious. Yes, reviewer number 2, I would agree that this is going over as contentious. The evidential bar for such claims is necessarily high, and I don't believe that it has been cleared here. The central issue is that the engravings themselves are not dated. So this is the big thing. This is the big thing that I said in the previous video, right? We don't have dates for them. Lee and colleagues are basically associating them with Homanaletti because they are the only hominins that have been in the Rising Star cave system outside of humans now currently exploring. And as I said in the previous video, to be fair, if these were Homo sapiens, if the individuals found in the cave were Homo sapiens, we would have no problem making that association. But as this reviewer says here, because of the nature of who's the proposed mark maker, the evidential bar for such claims is necessarily high. So Lee and colleagues are doing what is pretty standard for the field. You find a hominin in a cave system, you find markings in the cave system. That hominin probably made those markings. We do that for every other hominin. Like I said, if we're being consistent in the field, this is par for the course. However, this reviewer is basically implying that the double standard is appropriate given the nature of the claim, given that it is so different from a lot of the other associations that we've made. As the authors themselves note, the minimum age constraint provided by uranium thorium on flowstone does not necessarily relate to the last occupation of the naledi cave system, as the earlier ESR age on teeth does not necessarily document the first use of the cave. The authors state that, quote, at present we have no evidence limiting the time period across which Homanaletti was active in the cave system, unquote. On those grounds, though, assigning the age range of presently dated material within the cave system to the engravings, as the current title unambiguously does, is not justifiable. So this reviewer is being a lot harsher than the previous reviewer. The previous reviewer was like, what they're saying is interesting, a lot more tests before we can assess it. This reviewer is saying the language used by the authors to convey this potential discovery is much more definitive than it should be. Because we don't know when they were made, the association between the engravings and Homanaletti rests on the assertion that no humans entered and made alterations to the cave system between its last occupation by Homanaletti and its recent scientific recording. This is argued on page 6 with the statement, quote, no physical or cultural evidence for any other hominid population occurs within this part of the cave system. So this is what I was just saying, right? They're currently at least assigning the engravings to Homanaletti because nobody else has been in the cave. There's an important contrast between the quotes I've referred to in the last two paragraphs. In the earlier quote, the absence of evidence for Homanaletti in the cave system is not considered evidence for their absence before or after these ages. Just because we have no evidence that Homanaletti was in the cave at 200,000 years ago doesn't mean they weren't there, which is an argument I think most archaeologists would accept. When it comes to other species of humans, though, per the latter quote, the opposite approach is taken. So they're pointing out a discontinuity in the attitude of the authors here. So they're saying, yeah, just because we have no evidence that Homanaletti stopped, just because we don't have evidence that Homanaletti was in the cave after 200,000 years doesn't mean it stopped inhabiting the caves. Like, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. But then they turn around and they say the fact that we don't find evidence for humans in the caves means that humans weren't in the caves. This is something that the reviewer is saying. I do think that these two arguments are a little bit different because we do have evidence that Homanaletti was there, so its continued persistence is, I think, an easier pill to swallow than that Homo sapiens did come into the cave and left no trace of itself. But all of that being said, to positively associate the engravings with Homanaletti, you still gotta date them. So next, the reviewer discusses that they have an issue with how Homanaletti might have actually made these engravings. They quote the authors and say the lines appear to have been made by repeatedly and carefully passing a pointed or sharp lithic fragment or tool into the grooves. The authors then describe one rock with superficial similarities to a flake from the more recent site of Blombos to suggest that sharp-edged stones with which to make the engravings were available to Homanaletti, so that maybe they don't have to necessarily make the flakes that are being used to scratch them. They don't have to create their own stone tools to specifically accomplish this job. But then they go on to say, Blombos is considered relevant here presumably because it has evidence for Middle Stone Age engravings. The authors do not, however, demonstrate any use where on that stone object such that might be expected if it were used to carve dolomite. Given that it is presented as the only such find in the cave system so far, this seems important. So basically, there's not an association made between a rock that might have been used to perform such a task and the performance of that task, because there should be wear on the edges of the rock if it was used to scrape engravings into a dolomitic wall. My greater concern is that the authors did not compare the profile morphology of the Naledi engravings with the extensive literature on the morphology of scored lines caused by sharp stone implements. So basically, this is again another issue with citations, but this is an issue with citations in the art paper rather than the burial paper. So it seems like this is a chronic problem by the authors. I appreciate that the research group is reticent to undertake any invasive work until necessary, but non-destructive techniques could have been used to produce profiles with which to test the proposition that the engravings were made with a sharp-edged stone. So they're saying, yeah, they might look like engravings, but this would be another great way to, presumably here, test the difference between elephant skin dolomite and intentionally made engravings by a hominin using a sharp stone tool. One thing I noticed in this respect is that the engravings seem very wide, both in absolute terms and relative to their depth. The data I collected from the Middle Stone Age engraved ochre from Klein Kliphus, just pretend I said that right, suggested average line widths are typically around 0.1 to 0.2 millimeters. The engraved lines at Dinaledi appear much wider, perhaps 2 to 5 millimeters. This doesn't discount the possibility that the engravings in the Dinaledi cave system were carved with a sharp-edged stone tool. The ranges of outcomes for such engraving in soft rock can be quite variable, only that detailed analysis should precede rather than follow any assertion about their mode of formation. So again, this is just another example of a reviewer being like, guys, like, you might have something truly incredible here, but why didn't you do the tests first? None of this is to say that the arguments mounted here are wrong. It should be considered possible that Homanaletti made the engravings in the Dinaledi cave system. The problem is that other explanations are not precluded, so this is an equifinality issue. Now, one thing I want to note as well is that nobody so far has mentioned elephant skin dolomite directly, and nobody here is saying that they aren't engravings. They're all just saying, look, more tests should have been done. And I do notice a discontinuity between this reviewer and the previous one. The previous reviewer was like, can't wait to undertake the tests. At least they were kind of tentative, but we'll see. This one, and I would characterize the previous one perhaps maybe not even as negative, maybe as neutral. Whereas this reviewer is like, they shouldn't have presented this even potentially as art without doing it, an extensive series of tests. Okay, as an example, the western end of the Dinaledi subsystem has a particular geometry to the intersection of passages with 3 dominant orientations, 1 vertical, 2 diagonal. The major lines on panel A have 1 repeated vertical and 2 repeated diagonal, particularly the upper areas not impacted by stromatolites. The lines in both the cave system and the engravings appear to intersect at similar angles. Several of the cave features appear, superficially at least, to be replicated. In fact, scaled, rotated, and superimposed, figure 16 is is a plausible mud map of the western end of the Dinaledi system, carved incrementally by people exploring the caves. A figure showing this is included here, so that's pretty cool. It's a pretty cool tentative explanation. Of course, there are problems with this suggestion. The choice of the upper part of panel A is selective and similarly is superficial, and the scales are not necessarily comparable. However, the point is that such a mud map hypothesis is, as with the arguments mounted in the paper, both plausible and hard to prove. Having read the paper a few times, I'm intrigued by the engravings in the Dinaledi system and look forward to learning more about them as this research unfolds. Based on the evidence presently available, however, I feel that we have no robust grounds for asserting when these engravings were made, by whom they were made, and for what reason they were made. So this reviewer is like, well, shoot, if we're calling them art, they might as well just be a map of the cave system. But, that is just as plausible as anything potentially proposed by Berger and colleagues, because nothing has been tested yet. I think that was the point they're making overall. Okay, reviewer number 3. So the third reviewer starts, as many reviewers have, by summarizing the situation. However, they do refer to the fact that this is going to create much debate amongst the academic community of rock art specialists. Again, I refer you to why peer review is important, because if anybody is going to be having a debate over these potential engravings, it should be the academic community of rock art specialists. The reviewer notes that the title of the paper in reference to intentional designs leave no room for doubt as to where the authors stand, basically like they're definitively saying that it is art, despite the avoidance of the word art, entering a very disputed terrain. Ian Davidson's 2020 Marx Pictures and Art, Their Contributions to Revolutions in Communications, is also referenced here and forms a useful and clearly articulated evolutionary framework for this debate. The key questions are the markings artifactual or natural? How old are they, and who made them? Questions often intertwined here, as in the Pyrenees, are completely inseparable. I do not think that these questions are definitively answered in the paper, and I guess from the language used by the authors, they do not think so either. First, a few referencing issues. So again, we've got some huge issues with citations, And then they go on to say, before considering the specific arguments that the authors used to justify the claims of the title, we should recognize the shift in the academic climate of those concerned with ancient markings. So we're talking about sort of the status of where people stand on can non-humans, non-Homo sapiens make art? And then here's the big questions here. And they also say the stakes are high, but the demands are no less so. So back up your BS is kind of what this reviewer is saying. Why are the markings not natural? Berger and co-authors seem to find support for the artifactual nature of these markings and their location along a passage connecting chambers in the underground rising star system. The presumption is that hominins passed by the marked panel frequently. I recognize the thinking, but the argument is weak. More confidently, they note that in previous work, researchers have noted the limited depth of artificial lines, their manufacture form clear parallel striations, and their association into a clear arrangement of patterns as evidence for hominin manufacture. They also quote the section we just read when the authors were attempting to sort of preclude this idea that they could be naturally forming, such as what we see in elephant skin dolomite. More confidently, they note that, quote, in previous work, researchers have noted the limited depth of artificial lines, their manufactures from multiple parallel striations, and their association into clear arrangement or pattern as evidence of hominin manufacture. So we read this and then we looked at the elephant skin dolomite and we were like, or I did anyways, I'm including you in this journey. We looked at it and we were like, is that a clear distinguishment though? Because you can kind of see that in elephant skin dolomite, at least superficially. The markings in Rising Star Cave system are said to be shallow, made by repeated grooving with a pointed stone tool that has left striations within the grooves to form designs that are geometric expressions, including cross-hatching and cruciform shapes. Composition and ordering are said to be detectable in a set of grooved markings. Readers of this and their text will no doubt have various opinions about these matters, mostly related to rather poorly defined or quantified terminology. I reserve judgment, but would draw little comfort from the similarities among equally unconvincing examples of early, especially very early, designs. 2 or even 3 half-convincing arguments do not add up to one convincing one. Yeesh. The next paragraph touched on something the previous reviewer also mentioned, which is if they're using sharp objects to make these carvings, where are all the sharp objects? Only one potential lithic artifact is reported, a tool-shaped rock that does resemble tools from other contexts of more recent age in South Africa, such as a silkrete tool with abstract ochre designs on it that was recovered from Blombos. And this reviewer really has a beef with tool-shaped rock. First, tool-shaped rock is surely a meaningless term. In a modern tool shed, tool-shaped would surely need to be refined into saw-shaped, hammer-shaped, or chisel-shaped. And then they go on to say, to discuss the nature of how Homanaletti got down there with all of these tools. The latter is a painted fragment, not a tool, so any formal similarity is surely superficial and offers no support to the toolness of the Rising Star Cave object. Does that mean that Homanaletti took several pointed stone tools down into dark passageways, used them extensively, and, whether worn out or still usable, took them all out again when they left? Not impossible, of course. And the lighting. So again, I've mentioned this several times, Lee gave a talk on the potential for fire use back in December, and we still don't have that paper. We don't even have it in preprint. So I'm not sure, it's always possible that it's just hung up in peer review or that, it's in revisions or whatever, again, hung up in peer review. But that seems to be a huge piece of the puzzle with regard to assigning a lot of this stuff, a lot of this complex behavior, be it burial or be it the engravings or potential engravings, to Homanaletti. Because we know early Homo sapiens, Archaic Homo sapiens is capable of using fire, but we can't definitively assign that to Homanaletti yet. So, the authors rightly note that the circumstance of the markings makes it challenging to assess whether the engravings are contemporary with Homanaletti burial evidence from only a few meters away, and more pertinently, whether the hominins did the markings. Despite this honest admission, they are prepared to hypothesize that the hominin marked without, it seems, any convincing evidence. If archaeologists took juxtaposition to demonstrate authorship, there would be a number of unlikely claims for the authorship of rock paintings or even stone tools. So basically, this reviewer is saying that this association is not done archaeologically speaking. My understanding is that in paleontology it is, but maybe, again, I don't study this. and perhaps I'm not aware of a lot of the nuance going on there. The idea that there were no entries into this cave system between Homanaletti individuals and the last 2 decades is an assertion, not an observation, and the relationship between hominins and designs no less so. In fact, the only evidence for the age of the markings is given by the age of Homanaletti remains, and as no attempt at the admittedly very difficult, perhaps impossible task of geochronological assessment has been made. The claims relating to artificiality, age, and authorship made here seem entangled, premature, and speculative. Whilst there is no evidence to refute them, there isn't convincing evidence to confirm them. So again, we have another reviewer, this is reviewer number 7 overall, counting the burial stuff, who's saying big if true, but the standard of supporting these claims has not been met at present. Okay, reviewer number 4, let's check it out. Reviewer number 4 starts off with this banger of a sentence. This is a potentially landmark study with far-reaching consequences for archaeology, paleoanthropology, and more widely, I'll say. The antiquity of intentional human mark-making is a hot topic, but this study, understood as initial, has as yet incomplete sources of evidence and methods, and it will be interesting to follow how the study develops in subsequent studies. So basically, again, big if true, and then they detail their points. In the strengths, they have heuristic potential, decentering speciesism, so basically removing this idea that only Homo sapiens is capable of things like art, problematizing firsts and deep time. Ultimately, the manuscript presents evidence that those who are pro the deep antiquity of intentional mark-making by Homo, and potentially even other genera, will find enough evidence to support, while those skeptical of such claims will find enough methodological flaws and evidential limits to refute those claims. The next decade of work will likely be definitive, and this article makes a key contribution to the debate. And the weaknesses: definitions, dating, authorship. The study does not utilize either a geoscientist as one of the authorial team or a rock art specialist. So this is huge here, you guys, right? Like, Lee assembled this giant team for a lot of this work. Like, why were neither of these types of specialists included? Just something to note, something to be aware of. Use-ware analysis, viewshed, which is the rock art specialist would have added essential expertise on how to study anthropic marks. For example, the images of marks shown are all individual or small collections of motifs rather than showing each panel as well as all the panels together to help understand the iconographic context as an ensemble, a feature rather than isolated artifacts or motifs. Image enhancement. So this is a big one, and I've seen this as a problem noted by a lot of folks, which is like, there needs to be a lot more documentation going on here, and some of the figures, as we remember from the big black box that covers half or at least a fourth of the actual figure in the burial paper, they needed to have one more pass through with a lot of our figures and photos included. But they basically finished with their opening statement. Big if true, we will see. So now let's move on to the last paper, which is titled Burials and Engravings in a Small-Brained Hominid Homanaletti from the Late Pleistocene, Contexts and Evolutionary Implications. So this is the one that Fuentes was a main author on, and we'll read the abstract again as we do. Data from the recent explorations in the Dinaledi subsystem illustrates one of the earliest examples of a mortuary practice in hominins and offers the earliest evidence of multiple interments and funerary actions, as well as evidence of the early creation of meaning-making by a hominin. Okay, that sums it up pretty nicely, but it's, again, super definitive words, super definitive language there. The hominin undertaking these behaviors was a small-brained Homanaletti. These data call into question several key assumptions about the behavioral and cognitive evolution in the Pleistocene hominins. The evidence from Dinaledi pushes back the temporal origins of mortuary and funerary behaviors and associate the creation of meaning-making with a small-brained species that thus challenge key assumptions of the role and importance of encephalization in human evolution. Is a big brain what's necessary in order to do these behaviors or not? This suggests that the hominin sociocognitive niche and its relation to meaning-making activities is more diverse than previously thought. The association of these activities in subterranean spaces accessed and modified by the small brain species Homanaletti impacts assertions that technological and cognitive advances in human evolution are associated solely with the evolution of a large brain. So there's our abstract. Let's hit up the peer review. These are going to be quite short, just like the previous one. As this experience as a reviewer has been unusual, it may be helpful to outline some relative parameters of the task at the outset. While I was invited to review the Fuentes et al. Study, only 2 additional papers concerning the claimed engravings and burials associated with Homanaletti by Berger and colleagues were also provided as components of the reviewer package. The 2 manuscripts presenting archaeological evidence are accessible as preprints in bioRxiv by Lee, Berger, and colleagues. Unfortunately, the arguments in Fuentes et al. Manuscripts and Fuentes et al.'s manuscript hinge entirely on the strength of archaeological evidence for engravings and intentional burials by Homanaletti. All inferences regarding hominin behavior and biology of Homanaletti, as discussed by Fuentes and colleagues, are wholly dependent on the evidence presented and in the archaeology preprints being true. So, yeah, that's the summary of reviewer number 1, right? Like, all of what Fuentes is saying here is dependent on how the peer review hashes out and like how the acceptance and support for the claims made by the other 2 preprints, how all of that ends up. And as we saw, currently, at present, people are not wholly confident. Okay, so reviewer number 2 basically says the same thing. That Fuentes et al. Provide a detailed and thoughtful commentary on the evolution and behavioral implications of complex behavior associated with small brain hominins Homanaletti. However, we are not looking at anything like definitive here. The major weaknesses for Berger et al. 2023A are as follows. The mineral composition and sediment sampled from within naledi feature 1 are not different compared to surrounding sediment, which is one rationale proposed by the authors that would lead to the conclusion of a burial pit. An effort to replicate the multivariate statistical analysis using the data by this reviewer failed, and thus the results are not replicable. So my immediate question here is this reviewer the same reviewer that couldn't replicate the results given the data provided in the burial paper itself? Because if these are not the same person, then that is now 2 reviewers that could not replicate the analysis done by Berger and colleagues on the burial paper, which is really, really bad. Not good at all. 0 out of 10. Not good news. Uh-oh, stinky mode. Then there's the other possibility, I guess, which is that this reviewer is referring to the other reviewer, but I guess that's the same thing. That would still be 1 reviewer at least that couldn't replicate the results, and this person's just referring to them. I don't think that that's what's going on here because they refer to themselves as this reviewer. And they basically just go through all of the problems we've already discussed. They finish by basically saying that the work presented by the authors is imprudent and incomplete and does not meet the requirements set forth by our discipline. While it is important that scholars publish their work in a dutiful timeline, it is arguably more critical for scholars to take the necessary time to ensure the integrity and resolution of the work. The consequences for rushing out publications with such a significant unsubstantiated find will likely result in perilous ramifications, as it is more difficult to correct an idea than to introduce one. This last sentence really sums up, I think, my concern about this whole thing. We'll come back to this later, but like pushing out an idea like this, if it is truly as unsubstantiated as these peer reviewers are saying, is going to be really bad for the discipline as a whole. Paleoanthropology, as a field, having to retract an idea like this, especially one that has so many implications for human exceptionalism, why we are the way that we are, and why we're the only ones left. It's just going to be a rough pill to swallow if this ends up not panning out, if Berger's work ends up not panning out. And as somebody who tangles with young earth creationists all the time and creationists in general, that's going to be really annoying to deal with. So, there's my bias on it. So reviewer number 3, basically the same as everybody else. The paper presents cognitive implications of claims made in 2 accompanying papers about the creation of rock engravings and intentional disposal of the dead, as well as fire use. This is kind of just referred to, but still. The importance of the paper, therefore, relies on the validity of the claims for the presence of socioculturally complex and cognitively demanding behaviors that are presented in the associated papers. Given the archaeological, hominin, and taphonomic analysis in the associated papers are not adequate to enable the exceptional claims for naledi-associated complex behaviors, the inferences made in this paper are currently inadequate and incomplete. And I think that pretty much sums it up. As responsible and ethical researchers, the team must return to the sites, conduct the required standard chronometric and taphonomic studies, and weigh the strength of the evidence before proceeding with the current claims. Chronometric, not chronometric, sorry. Okay, so reading all of these through with you here, I'm going to reconsider my previous statement that all 11 reviews were negative. Only 10 were negative, one was neutral, and I think it was the first reviewer on this sort of final collection paper. I think that reviewer was like, cool, can't wait to see what happens next. We'll see, I guess, winky face. But with these kinds of reviews being levied against all three of these preprint manuscripts, I'm going to echo sentiment that I saw on Twitter. I think they probably shouldn't have published. I think they probably should have withdrawn the manuscripts until they could carry out some more in-depth analyses, squared away the analyses that they did conduct, and make sure that they could actually be replicated by other people, and generally reconsidered the language that they utilized within especially the first two papers. Okay, so now that we've got all the criticism, the dunking, if you will, out of the way, we have the author response. Now remember, with eLife's current model, they had the submitted preprints available for everybody. Everybody could look at them, and then when the actual preprints were published, they were published with the peer review, but that peer review didn't actually have any real impact on whether or not the manuscripts would be published. They do impact the eLife assessment, but the eLife assessment isn't going to decide whether or not they are or are not published. It's just something that they put a little rubber stamp at the top where they're like, we either approve of the manuscript as it is, or like, here's what you should consider. It's basically a trigger warning, isn't it? It's a trigger warning that applies to what you're about to read. And we'll still go over those eLife assessments as well. We'll read the eLife assessment, at least for the burial paper, because it's very funny. But first, we're going to appreciate the author response. We're going to consider it, and I'm going to give you my thoughts on it, and then we'll see what happens next. I'm already exhausted. This video is like 2.5 hours long already. Probably longer once all is said and done. I like to imagine that this is going to be quick, but we know it's not going to be quick. Okay. We would like to thank the eLife reviewers for considerable time and effort that they have invested to review these manuscripts. We've also benefited from a previous round of review of the manuscripts describing the proposed burial features, which underwent 2 rounds of revision in a high-impact journal over a period of approximately 8 months during 2022, and early 2023. So what they're saying here is they tried to submit these to a different high-impact journal, maybe Nature or Science, and that it went through 2 rounds of revisions, which is kind of startling that this is the state of it after 2 rounds of revisions, but I digress. Both sets of reviews have reflected mixed responses to the evidence we've presented, with one reviewer recommending acceptance with minor editorial revisions. So this is maybe language, organization, things like that. 2 recommending exceptions with minor revisions. So this is revisions to the actual paper, the content of the paper itself, maybe adding additional tests and analyses or figures, and the 4th recommending rejection based off of similar arguments to those reflected by some of the reviewers in this current round of reviews at eLife. Ultimately, the managing editor of this first journal took the decision that the review process could not be completed in a timely manner and rejected the manuscript, although submission here reflected our consideration of these reviewers' suggestions. So it ended up getting rejected by the high-impact journal. I guess they didn't pull it, it was rejected. We've chosen this initial response to eLife reviewers to include some of the references to previous anonymous reviews in order to illustrate differences of opinion and differences in revision suggestions within the review process. Our goal is to offer maximal insight into our decision-making process and to acknowledge the considerable time and effort put into the assessment of these manuscripts by reviewers, for eLife and in the case of the earlier review process. We hope that this approach will assist readers and reviewers of our manuscripts in understanding why we are proceeding with certain decisions during the revision process. This is a new process for us and reviewers, and one in which it significantly differs from more traditional reviews is that both the reviews and our reply will be public well in advance of our revisions to the manuscript. Indeed, considering the scope of the reviews and some of those revisions may take considerable time, although many can be accomplished fairly easily. Thus, we are not in a position to say that we have solved every issue raised by the reviewers. Instead, we will examine what appears to be the key critical issues raised by regarding the data and the analyses, and how we propose to address these as we revise the papers. We will also address several philosophical and ethical issues raised by the reviews and our proposal for dealing with these. More specific editorial and citational recommendations will be dealt with on a case-by-case basis, and we do not address these point by point in this reply. Please note, this response to reviewers, this response to the reviewers is not the revision of the manuscript and is only the initial opinion of the corresponding authors with some guidance from the larger group of authors of all three papers. Our final submitted revision will reflect the input of all authors included on those submissions. We took the decision to submit 3 separate papers consciously. The 2 different categories of evidence, burials and engravings, involve different kinds of analysis and different, although overlapping, teams of researchers, and we recognize that each deserve their own presentation and assessment. Meanwhile, together they inform the context of Homanaletti in a way that requires some synthetic discussion in which both kinds of evidence are relevant, leading to a third paper. But the mutual relevance of these different kinds of evidence and their review by a common set of reviewers naturally raises cross-cutting issues, and the reviewers have cross-referenced in these articles. This has sometimes led to suggestions about one manuscript based off of the contents of another. Considering the situation, we accepted the recommendation that it would be clearer to consider all 3 articles in a single reply. Thus, while each of the 3 papers will proceed separately during the revision process, it will be necessary to highlight across all 3 papers occasionally in our response. So, one response to all of the reviews for 3 papers. Okay, so it's not 100% clear to me, but I think what's going on here is that there are still going to potentially be revisions to the papers published as is. I think that they can accept, based off of what we read from the eLife summary earlier, I think it's still possible for them to revise the manuscript and then resubmit it, and maybe the eLife assessment will change, or the reviewers will add additional thoughts. But it's not 100% clear, again, I think because this is like a brand new model of publishing. But let's put a big asterisk on the papers, I guess, because there's still the potential for reconsidering some of the things that they've said, some of the language that they've used. They might still change, I think. Tell me if you think that I'm wrong here, let me know in the comments. Okay, so beginning with the scientific issues. In reading the reviews, we feel there are 9 critical points or assertions raised by one or more of the reviewers that present the problem for or challenge our hypothesis that the observed evidence, bone accumulations, and engravings described in the naledi subsystem are of intentional naledi-genic origin. These are: 1. The evidence presented does not demonstrate a clear interruption of the floor sediments, thus failing to demonstrate excavated holes. I really want to see their response to that one. Number 2. The sediments infilling the holes where skeletal remains are found have not been demonstrated to originate from the disruption of the floor sediments and thus could be a part of natural geologic processes, water movement, slumping, or carnivore accumulations. The slumping, cover the slumpingly. Number 3, previous geological interpretations by our research group have given alternative geological explanations for the formation of the bony accumulations that contradict the previous evidence presented here and result in alternative origins hypothesis. This one I have less of a problem with. Like, yeah, if they really want to relook at their previous claims that water movement could have influenced the accumulations of individuals in the cave. If they want to reassess that given what they find now, I don't see that as a huge issue, although it's a little weird. Number 4, burial cannot be effectively assessed without complete excavation of the features in sight. Number 5, the skeletal remains as presented do not conform clearly to typical body arrangements or positions associated with human Homo sapiens burials. Number 6, there is no evidence of grave goods or lithic scatters that are typically associated with human burials. I'm more interested in the lithic scatter thing with regard to the art, but still. Number 7, humans may have been involved with the creation of either the Homanaletti bone accumulations, the engravings, or both. Number 8, without a date for the engravings, the null hypothesis should be that the engravings were created by Homo sapiens. I would have just said other hominins. That's the vibe that I got from the reviewers. Maybe not necessarily Homo sapiens, but other hominins. And number 9, the null hypothesis for the explanation of the skeletal remains in this situation should be natural accumulation. I do think that should be the null there. Okay, so they talk about how their hypothesis is that this was an intentional burial and that it was a fleshed body specifically, that was placed into a hole and then filled. This is for issue number 1. Then they say, we recognize that the 4 eLife reviewers are not convinced that our presentation is sufficient to establish this. Interestingly, this was not the universal opinion of earlier reviewers of the initial manuscript, several of whom felt we had adequately supported this hypothesis. That's cool to say, but you can also just say that, right? This isn't something that we can actually examine. This is just something that Lee and colleagues can be like, well, the earlier guys didn't have an issue with it. Without seeing the reviews themselves, who's to say, really? This has no bearing on my opinion of the manuscripts. The lack of clarity in this current version of the burial manuscript is our responsibility. Okay, cool. In the upcoming version of this paper to be submitted, we will take the reviewer's critiques to heart and add additional figures that will illustrate better the description of the lorm. So this is the orange-red mudstone. What was it? Laminated orange-red mudstone. And clarify the sedimentological data showing the material covering the skeletal remains in the hole are disrupted sediments excavated from the same hole. Okay, cool. So they're gonna be clearer and maybe add additional analyses there. Awesome. We're proposing to isolate this most critical evidence for burial into a separate section in the revised submission based on the reviewer's comments. The fact that the lorm layer is disrupted, a flesh body was placed in the hole created by this disruption, and that the body and perhaps parts of other bodies were then covered by the same sediment from the hole is a central feature of our hypothesis that bone accumulations observed reflect a burial and not a natural process. Why parts of other bodies if it's an intentional burial? Has any other hominin done that? Has any human done that? Where we bury like a body and then part of another body? I mean, maybe it wouldn't surprise me if they had, I guess, in all of human history, but like, this is weird to include here. This feels like an inoculation ahead of time against a potential criticism that might be coming down the line. That's strange to me. Okay, but then we move on to the fluvial transport. The possibility of fluvial transport or involvement in the subsystem is a topic that we've addressed extensively in past work. Yeah, we saw that. We emphasize that fluvial transport of whole bodies in the subsystem is precluded by several lines of sedimentological evidence. I don't think anybody is saying that flooding is still on the table. So it's kind of weird that they're spending a moment of time discussing this, because like water flow is not what any of the reviewers had an issue with. Like, they weren't suggesting that water flow might have done it. They were suggesting that the wetness of the cave would lead to the slumping of sediments, and that might cause bodies to roll down the hill and also become partially covered, partially buried. But like, water was not really discussed, at least not by full-on fluvial transport. Okay, so they talk about how little their excavation was. We're thus left with the uncertainty that led us to suggest the possibility of sediment slumping or movement through subsurface drains, although these were not observed near our excavation. So they're saying that they allowed the possibility of slumping in their previous work, but like that this was mostly just because they hadn't done a lot of work on the excavation yet. Their current work expands on the knowledge of subsurface and presents an alternative explanation for the disposition of skeletal remains from earlier excavation. But we acknowledge that our new explanation is vulnerable to our own previous published proposals, and we must do a better job of explaining how the new information addresses our previous suggestions. Yeah, that's totally true. So, because like, if they're saying that slumping was a possibility previously, and they were, as we covered, they didn't do a very good job of showing that they were wrong previously. They were kind of just like, we reassessed it under our current ideas, and we think that our current hypothesis that these are all intentional burials and that slumping doesn't play a role. Like, you're kind of just saying that, I guess. This is kind of confusing to me. By not clearly creating a section where we explained how these previous hypotheses were now nullified by current evidence, we clearly confused the readers, and me as well, with our own previous work. We will revise the manuscript by enhancing the reviews of significant geological evidence, demonstrating that there is no significant fluvial action in the system, and making it clear how the burial hypothesis provides a clear explanation for the situation of skeletal remains from our previous excavation work. Okay, but like, what the heck? What's going on here? Because they talk about fluvial stuff up here, so flooding didn't do it, which nobody is saying that it did. And then they're like, we know we previously said that slumping could do it. Slumping not by fluvial, like by water inundation in the form of flooding, but by like, oh, it's a wet environment and like groundwater comes up and makes the sediment soft and leads to slumping. That's definitely different than like water actually filling the cave well past ponding. And then they go back and say, we're going to improve on this by including a section that says it's not fluvial again. But that's not include why it's not slumping. That's what we need to see. Why isn't it slumping? Why is burial a better explanation than slumping? One of the central issues raised by the reviewers has been a perceived need to excavate the features completely. So that's all they say. Do they not talk about the PCA analysis, how it was unable to be replicated, how the PCA in general was really weird, and diagenesis? They don't talk about any of that in here? I haven't completely read this reply. Okay, well, I guess we'll find out. Later improved excavation standards have not sufficed. Oh, excuse me. I was all the way up here. Totally exhuming all the skeletal. Reviewers have written that it is necessary to identify every skeletal element that is present and account for any missing elements. On this point, we have both ethical and scientific differences from these reviewers. We express our ethical concerns first. Many of the best preserved possible burials ever discovered by archaeologists were subjected to total excavation and exhumation. Cases like La Chapelle, La Forest, and Skull were fully excavated at a time when data recording and excavation methods did not include the range of spatial and geomorphological approaches that later became routine. The judgment of early investigators that these situations were intentional burials was challenged by later workers, and this kind of information might enable better tests. And the kind of information that might enable better tests have been irrevocably lost because they were pulled out. So they're saying, like, by pulling the materials totally out, you lose potentially context that could be gained by, like, in situ analyses. Okay, I understand that. Later improved excavation standards have not sufficed to remove uncertainty or debate about possible burials. For example, it was long presumed that well-preserved remains of young children were themselves diagnostic of intentional burials, such as those those in all of these locations. Such cases were also fully excavated with adequate documentation of the positioning of skeletal remains and their surrounding stratigraphic situation, but such cases were later challenged on several bases, and the complete exhumation of material has confused or precluded the testing of new hypotheses. Okay, so they're basically like, we did this intentionally, we didn't intentionally remove everything. Okay, sure. In our decision to leave material in place as much as possible, we are expanding upon the standard practice to leave witness sections and unexcavated areas for further research. This situation is novel, representing possible burials by non-human species, and that makes it doubly important, for our opinion, to be conservative in not fully exhuming the skeletal material from the context. Okay, sure. We welcome suggestions of additional methods and analyses set to test the Homanaletti burial hypothesis. But then the next two sections are really weird. They argue that totally exhuming everything wouldn't actually fix the problem as outlined by reviewers, and that they're kind of waiting just to perform additional tests on the material in situ, which, okay, sure, that's fine. Like they mention non-invasive 3D and 4D modeling, which, sure, cool, whatever. But what's really weird is in discussing the problem that reviewers had about the body's positioning and how the positioning of the bones doesn't seem to support, some of the reviewers proposed anyways, that it doesn't seem to support intentional burial and like decay with like matrices, the matrices of the matrix of rock supporting the elements as decay is occurring underground, the way things fall and end up vertical or horizontal. There's a lot of rich literature surrounding that, believe it or not. But their response to this is really weird. They basically just say, just because our burials and the position of Homanaletti in these proposed pits, right? Just because it doesn't match the typical human burial, like Homo sapiens burial and body positioning, is not in itself evidence that these are not Homanaletti burials. So they're basically just hand-waving that criticism and saying, well, so what? Maybe it doesn't meet the expectations that reviewers who study archaic Homo sapiens burials have of positioning and how things decompose, but that doesn't mean it's not a burial. But that's weird because they used positional behavior as support for them being a burial. And now that it's shown to not be supportive of that, or that the reviewers are proposing it's not supportive of that, well now, so what? Naledi might have just been different, which is strange to me. We feel that the reviewers, in keeping with many paleoanthropologists, have a clear idea on what they think a burial should look like in an idealized sense, but this Platonic ideal of burial form is not matched by the extensive literature in Archaeo Thanatology, funeral archaeology, and forensic science, which indicates enormous variability in the activity, morphology, and post-mortem system experienced by the human body in the cases of interment and body disposal. True, but then why use it as an argument for it, right? Decades of experience in the identification, recovery, and interpretation of clandestine, deviant, and non-formal burials indicates the Platonic ideal is rare and in many contexts the exception. This variability is particularly relevant to morphological traits in burial contexts, such as the informal nature of grave cut in plane and section, shallow burial in depth, and the initial disposition of the body, placement during the early postmortem period. These might run counter to the expectations of reviewers or others referencing the fossil hominin record, but are well accepted within the communities of researchers investigating the Holocene archaeological sites and forensic contexts. So they're basically saying, yeah, Homanaletti might not meet the expectations of early Homo sapiens or early hominid burials in general, but it might just be burial by like later genus Homo, like or later Homo sapiens. That's really weird. That's really weird to say, in my opinion. Saying that Homaneletti's burial context might be more similar to like more advanced, if you will, Homo sapiens as compared to early hominins, of which this is more similar to, morphologically speaking. That's very strange to me. It is encouraging to see reviewers beginning to incorporate the extensive, often experimentally derived literature from Archaeo Thanatology and forensic taphonomy in their deliberations, and we will be taking these comments on board going forward. In particular, we acknowledge reviewers' comments and the need to construct a more detailed postmortem narrative accounting for joint disarticulation, displacement, and final disposition of elements within the burial space. As such, we will incorporate the hierarchy of decomposition, associations between regions of anatomical association, areas of disarticulation and disassociation, and the voids produced during decomposition into our narrative. And then they talk about how they've previously addressed why it's not a carnivore den, which, sure, I agree. I don't think anybody, other than that one little aside in one of the reviewers for the burial papers, I don't think anybody is really arguing that it could still be. It's really hard to get in there again, and as noted by Lee and colleagues here, there's the absence of any carnivore-induced bone surface modifications, so chewing marks, patterns of skeletal part representation, dropping bones in different places, and a total absence of any carnivore remains within the naledi chamber. We don't find any carnivores in there. The next section talks about dating. Reviewers suggest that without a date derived from geochronological methods, the engravings cannot be associated with Homanaletti, and that it is possible, or at least probable, that the engravings were done in the recent past by Homo sapiens. Possible, I think, is the better statement there, because I don't think anybody asserted that Homo sapiens did do them. This suggestion neglects the context of the site, and then they talk about, for this remainder of a section here, they talk about how Homanaletti is the only thing found in there. So we already discussed this, right? Homanaletti is the only one in there. There are potential engravings in there, so Homanaletti did the potential engravings. That's the argument as stated, and that's the argument as typically utilized by Homo sapiens. When Homo sapiens is found in an area and there's art in an area, it's pretty easy to get people on board with the idea that Homo sapiens made the art or the engravings or whatever it is. But as mentioned by one of the reviewers, the reason this maybe doesn't work so well for Homanaletti, and maybe there's a bit of a double standard, is because this is a hominin with half the brain case size in a very difficult to reach area for which fire hasn't been definitively associated with as a part of the toolbox of this hominin. So I do think that it's a little bit different. Although they do note here, we deliberately left out qualifying language, so potential engravings, so that the title would take the form of a testable hypothesis rather than a weak assertion. So if future work find the engravings were not produced within this time range, we will restate the hypothesis. Okay, sure, that's a preference thing. I don't think that's as huge of a deal. Although I also feel that there might have been some motivation there, especially with regard to how it was presented to news organizations. Maybe that's me being, conspiracy pilled, but I digress. Finally, with regard to the engravings, we've chosen to report them because they exist. That's a straightforward statement, and I don't necessarily disagree with getting the information out there. Not reporting the presence of engraved marks on the walls of a cave above hypothesized burials would be tantamount to leaving relevant evidence out of the description of an archaeological context. We recognize and state in our manuscript that these markings require substantial further study, including attempts at geochronological dating, but the current evidence is clearly relevant to the archaeological context of the subsystem. We take a similar stance with reporting the presence of the tool-shaped artifact near the hand of the Homanaletti skeleton in the hill antechamber. It is evident from that this object requires further study, as we stated in our manuscript. But again, omitting this from the study would be leaving out relevant evidence, he says here. Okay, sure. Some have suggested that the null hypothesis should be that all of these observed circumstances are of natural origin. Our team took this approach in our early investigation of the Naledi subsystem. We adopted the null hypothesis that the geological processes involved in the accumulation of Homanaletti skeletal remains were natural, and we were able to reject many alternative explanations for the assemblage, including carnivore accumulations, death trap accumulation, and fluvial transport of bodies or bones. This led us to the hypothesis that Homanaletti were involved in bringing the bodies into the spaces where they were found, but we did not hypothesize their involvement in the formation of the deposit itself beyond bringing the bodies to the location. This approach seems conservative. True. Why is this not still the case, though? right? Like, why didn't they address the possibility of Homanaletti just dropping the bodies into the cave, them falling down, sediment slumping, and subsequent burial, resulting in the appearance of burials of these hominins? Why wasn't that addressed in this paper as a part of the null? It follows the traditional view that small-brained hominins did not engage in cultural practices, but we recognize in hindsight that this null hypothesis approach did harm our analysis. It impeded us from recognizing within our initial excavations of the puzzle box area and other excavations that we might be encountering remains that were intrusive in the sedimentary floor of the chamber. If we had approached the accumulation of a large number of hominins from the perspective of the null hypothesis being that the situation was likely cultural, we would perhaps have collected evidence in a slightly different manner. Right, but that's just part of it, right? Like, you have to pick a null hypothesis and move forward with that in mind, right? Hindsight is 2020. Yeah, everybody's probably going to change how they would do things if they had the information in the future back in the past. But the fact of the matter is we don't. We pick a null hypothesis and we move forward with that in mind. It would have been entirely inappropriate, I think, for them to have started with the idea that the small-brained hominin Homanaletti was doing funeral caching as as being like the cultural null, if you will. We certainly note that if the Naledi system had been full of the remains of modern humans, there would be little doubt that the null hypothesis would have been it was a cultural space and not a natural space. We therefore respectfully disagree with the reviewers who continue to support the idea that we should approach the hominin excavations with the null hypothesis that they were natural in origins. If excavations continue with this mindset, we believe that potential cultural evidence is almost certain to be lost. This next section is really strange to me. So they talk about how because Homanaletti is burying its dead, at least as proposed by them, that all small-brained hominin assemblages should be reconsidered under the context of potential cultural practice. And what they say here is that this includes AL333, the Australopithecus afarensis site, the Dakika infant, WT15000, Turkana boy, that one might be a bit more appropriate, and even AL288, as such unusual taphonomic situations where skeletons are preserved cannot be simply explained away as natural in origins based solely on the cranial capacity and assumed lack of cognitive and cultural complexity of the hominins as emphasized by us in Fuentes 2023. Now, studying hominins on the precipice of cultural behavior is going to be difficult inherently, because some things that previously in the fossil record, wherever that may be, were definitely natural, are going to transition to something that could potentially be cultural. So, for example, if you find Sahelanthropus chilensis with, a bunch of broken bones at the bottom of a pit somewhere, it's probably because Sahelanthropus chilensis fell into the pit. But if you find Homo erectus in the same situation, it's possible that it was thrown down there by other members of its group as some kind of funeral caching practice. That is a possibility. Where in the fossil record does that start being a possibility? This is the question here. And what Lee Berger and colleagues are proposing is that because Homanaletti was potentially burying its dead, every single small-brained hominin must be reconsidered under that cultural context, under the possibility that some of their preservation was cultural instead of natural. Things like the Dakika child, maybe its family placed it there. But part of the reason why Lee and colleagues came to the conclusion that this might be cultural is because they considered it might be cultural. And that's going to color your interpretation of the data moving forward. This is why you have to test the idea that it's natural first in every context. Because believe it or not, there are ways, as outlined by every single one of the reviewers, well, except for the neutral reviewer, by almost every single one of the reviewers, there are ways to discriminate the natural accumulation of dead individuals and the intentional preservation of them. And not all of the discriminating tests were performed by Lee and colleagues. That's the problem. They say, we are not the first to suggest or observe that some early hominin situations may represent early mortuary activity, Pettit 2013. So this is about the origins of human burial. And a suggestion is very different from a series of papers that conclusively states burial is going on in a small-brained hominin. But we would advocate a step further. We suggest it may be damaging to take the natural accumulation as the standard null hypothesis for hominin paleoanthropology, and that it is more conservative in practice to engage remains with the null hypothesis of possible cultural formation. I couldn't disagree more. I think that possible cultural formation is the next step after determining that natural accumulation is unlikely, at the very least. We are deeply grateful for the time and effort of all 8 reviewers across 3 reviews that they have taken with this work. Okay, so we know that there's definitely repetition of some of the reviewers because there are 11 reviews total. So I would say at this point, it's probable that that reviewer who did the testing, who tried to replicate Lee and colleagues' analysis, that was the same person in the first and third review. We also acknowledge the anonymous reviewers from previous submissions whose opinions and comments will have made their final iterations of these manuscripts better for their efforts. As this process is rather public and includes commentary outside of the ELAE forum, we ask that the efforts of all 37 authors and 8 reviewers involved be respected and that the discourse remain professional in all venues as we study this fascinating and quite complex occurrence. We also appreciate the efforts of the members of the public who have engaged with this relatively new process, where preprints are posted prior to the reviews, allowing comments and interactions from colleagues and the public who are normally not part of the initial the internal peer review process. We believe these interactions will make for better final papers. We feel that we have met the standards of demonstrating burials in Homanaletti and that the engravings are most likely associated with Homanaletti. However, given the reviews, we see many areas where our clarity, context, and analyses were less strong than they can be. With clarifications and additions taken on board through these review processes, the final papers will be stronger and clearer. We recognize that this is an ongoing process for scientific investigation, and further work will allow continued and possibly better evaluation of these hypotheses and others. Personally, I'm really not happy with that author's response. It felt like a lot of hand-waving, and what wasn't hand-waved was pretty shallow as far as responses go. What was most disturbing is the recognition of many of the problems, followed by the continued assertion that they felt they demonstrated properly that Homanaletti did in fact bury its dead, and that the engravings are in fact non-natural engravings done by Homanaletti. I think that there is a lot more work that needs to be done, and I think that this whole situation really emphasizes how important peer review is, because, again, I bought a lot of the original claims in the burial paper especially, and I think that the peer reviews brought to light many issues that I did not consider myself as problematic, but I think are convincingly problematic. These reviews came out after the preprints, and the preprints were what started the media blitz, or what accompanied the media blitz as directed by Lee Berger. It's a little bit concerning, I guess, that he chose to lead the media announcement in his multiple interviews with many different news organizations with the preprints rather than with the actual published manuscripts and accompanying peer review. I think that there's a possibility that he knew that the peer review was going to be a little bit scathing, and so he wanted to get ahead of it and present his findings without the controversial pushback. And I find that a little bit, I don't think that's good. I don't think that's a good thing, let's put it that way. In a way that's not going to make me enemies unnecessarily. Now, the public did react when these peer reviews came out, and some organizations, news organizations, covered them, although not as many and not as in-depth. So furor in the scientific community over claims that small-brained early humans were intelligent, but that's not the argument. That's not what the furor is about. The furor is about the methodology behind the burials and behind the association of this art or proposed engravings. First, are they natural or non-natural? And second, are they associated with Homanaletti? Peer reviews of Homanaletti study are in, and they are scathing in their assessment, accusing researchers of over-exaggerating the facts. The claims are inadequate, incomplete, and largely assumption-based rather than evidence-based, said one, while another called the papers imprudent and incomplete. So none of those are arguing against the intelligence of Homanaletti, right? A research team's findings of pre-human burial site was publicly lauded. Then came the peer reviews, right? But this is the Daily Princetonian, The Guardian, and yonews.com, not CNN, no coverage in the Netflix documentary. There was a little bit more fuss over on Twitter. A lot of people talked about it. A lot of people commented on the nature of how we should move forward with regard to sort of meeting with the media over new finds, how they should potentially wait until after peer review. There was a lot more discussion on Twitter really than anywhere else. The e-life assessment now sits pinned like a trigger warning at the top of all of the papers. I think it's different for every paper, but this is the one for the burial. And it states the authors studied the context of the skeletal remains of 3 individuals and associated sediment samples to conclude that the hominin species Homanaletti intentionally buried their dead. Demonstration of the earliest known instance of intentional funerary practice with a relatively small-brained hominin engaging in a highly complex behavior that had otherwise been observed from Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalensis would be a landmark finding. However, the evidence for these claims is considered inadequate in the current version of the studies. The 4 reviewers were in strong consensus that the methods, data, and analyses do not support the primary conclusions. Without full excavations, the study is missing crucial geoarchaeology, including micromorphology and taphonomic components, among other limitations, that make the premature conclusion that Homanaletti intentionally buried their dead. The null hypothesis must be that these skeletons accumulated naturally, and the research must then reject the null hypothesis and robustly exclude equifinality in order to justifiably draw the remarkable conclusions made in the present version of this paper. But who's going to see the e-life assessment and who's going to read the peer reviews other than those directly involved in paleoanthropology and very interested laymen? The folks who watch the Netflix documentary, the folks that read Cave of Bones, are probably not going to immediately finish those 2 pieces of media and rush to Google Scholar just to find out what the consensus is on these ideas. I think most of them are going to finish those pieces of media or the articles that came out in CNN and Nat Geo, and they're going to go, wow, that's really cool. How awesome. I sure do love paleoanthropology. And if all of this turns out to be a bit hyped, or if any of it turns out to be untrue, that is going to severely damage the general public's trust in paleoanth as a field. And I just think that is so sad. I think that sucks so much, I can't even express it to you. Because the truth of the matter is, Rising Star Cave is incredible as a location. You have over 24 individuals of a species that is really freaking weird. It's a fascinating, fascinating topic. And really what's going on there is absolutely remarkable, whatever it is. And it honestly might be burial. And Homanaletti might have made these engravings, if they are in fact engravings. All of that might still be true, as underscored by all of the reviewers. But they haven't shown that to be the case definitively. And that's the problem. That's what's so concerning. That is what makes me very nervous. And this is outlined really well, I think, by Chris Stringer, who, I'm always academically simping for, who says in this article, Rising Star is such a great site, and the naledi material is so wonderful that there really is no need to over-egg the pudding, said Chris Stringer of the Natural History Museum London, adding, it's going to cause problems of credibility in the future, which may even affect funding for more work. And Paige Madison, who I also respect a great deal, and who's an incredible paleoanthropologist, says to push a notion that is so unsubstantiated that it has been met by rejection by the scientific community is irresponsible. This sucks. This sucks so much. It sucks so much to have to make this video. I'm so sad to have to report on this, to have to report on what is potentially an overhyped situation with not enough evidence to back it up in paleoanthropology, especially one as cool as this, with Homanaletti potentially burying its dead and potentially making engravings inside a cave. I am so bummed to have to disseminate this to you. But I think it is the responsibility of folks in academia to be good science communicators. I think it's our job to make information digestible to anybody who's interested, whether they're in academia or not. And so it is just as much my job to tell you when something might not be as rock solid as I would like it to be, as it is for me to tell you when something cool goes down, when something really awesome and fascinating happens. What I do think is important to know, just as a side branch for someone like me who combats pseudoscience on the internet, is for all of those interested who are constantly seeing things like young earth creationists or race realists or whatever cast doubt on the scientific community, this is what actual contested bones looks like. This is what actual arguments look like in academia. This is how they hash out. This is how they occur. At the very least, you should have a lot of confidence in most of what comes out in paleoanthropology, because when it is unsubstantiated, you get uproars like this. You know when something might be overhyped. I'm sure this whole thing has also been really hard on the team, Berger and his colleagues who worked on these 3 manuscripts, because, things in academia, they tend to get a little heated, and I'm sure that things have not remained entirely objective and have not, refrained from straying into the personal. But that being said, I really don't know anybody, even the people who are really critical of these manuscripts, I don't know anybody who doesn't really want Lee to be right, because that would just be the coolest. It would be so awesome, so epic, and such a fascinating addition to the story of human evolution and of hominin evolution, because as it turns out, as we keep finding out, there always is more than one way to be human. However, I would be remiss if I didn't cover a little bit of Lee's response to all of this, because there was a very interesting thing that he said in an interview that sort of covered the contention regarding the manuscripts in the peer review. In this article by The Guardian, for instance, we get this series of paragraphs. Berger, whose book Cave of Bones will be published by National Geographic next month, is unrepentant. In an interview with The Observer last week, he insisted his team's recent research was solid and reliable. The Rising Star research is not just the work of 1 or 2 scientists, but is backed by dozens of researchers. Quote, their scientific opinion should not be outweighed by 2 or 3 or 4 reviewers. That's not the way that it works, Berger said. Not every scientist is convinced by this stance, however. Quote, rather than engaging with concerns, the team appears to be denying problems with their methods and analysis and are attacking peer reviewers' motives in an attempt to undermine the criticism, said Madison, unquote. Nevertheless, Berger remained adamant that his team would be vindicated. Quote, we haven't stopped working in the chamber, and more evidence is coming. We will continue to present more evidence, and we will keep these criticisms under our belts. But I will say to critics who demand more evidence, we will deliver that evidence. So be careful what you wish for, unquote. Okay. Yes. Excellent. Please do. Why does this sound less like a promise and more like a threat? It's just kind of weird, right? And to add a little bit extra to this, right, Lee's Twitter, after all of these peer reviews, and also before the peer reviews, has mostly been concerned with promoting interviews that he himself has done, and also Cave of Bones. And I don't know that that is the appropriate response given the situation at hand. So, here's his Twitter, and it's all Cave of Bones, all of it, and interviews that he's involved with, right? So this one, kind of cool metrics, Netflix Cave of Bones. I never knew that this stuff existed, nor understand exactly what it means, but it's neat to look at. Top 10 on streaming in the world, Cave of Bones, right? Statistics for how the documentary is doing, talking about the book, promoting previous books, all sorts of stuff like that. And I guess I would have just preferred, there's a little bit of extra stuff in here. So here he's talking about, he's got an open question on pitting, weird pitting in that tooth. But a lot of it is just talking about his documentary and his book. And given the peer reviews, I would have liked to see a little bit more engagement with the criticism, although there is a lot of retweeting people who are taking his side in the criticism, which I also don't love. But I also don't know that you can expect any different from somebody, because he does, I'm sure, feel like he's a little bit personally being attacked. I also know graduate students who have been blocked by Lee for having opinions that run contra to his own or poking fun at him, things of that nature. I don't know about that either. It's a weird situation, and I don't like it. Let's put it that way. Whew. No enemies for me today. Anyways, you guys, I hope you enjoyed this really long coverage of the continuing drama behind Homanaletti and the Rising Star cave system in general. It's good to be back. I'm glad to start my return off right by sitting down in front of the camera and rambling incoherently for 2.5 hours at you guys. But if you like what I do, you can support me by liking, commenting, and subscribing. All of those are free. Or alternatively, you can head on over to my Patreon and become a patron there, or you can donate to my PayPal. And I would also say you can support me via stores, but I'm sick of Redbubble taking such a huge cut. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to probably make my own store here soon. It's a work in progress. For now, you can buy my stuff on Redbubble and Teespring, but that link is broken. So support me on Redbubble, even though I don't like them sometimes. And I'll see you in the next one.